Welcome, friends. We're very grateful at the National Library to have been accommodated here in this lovely room by Pearse Street Library, so I'd like to express our thanks to them. I was happy to open this morning's event with those words, a Cordia, because you may recall that Cordia, friends, was the word used by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on her historic visit to Dublin. And I think it is appropriate to mark her passing and to pass on our condolences to those who are grieving in the context of this morning's event, given that she played such an important role in remembering the histories of these islands and in promoting peace across our country and with our neighbours. When I was growing up in Galway, in the west of Ireland, my grandmother talked very freely about her father, my great-grandfather, who had been a mechanic in the British Army, and about her brother, who had been in the IRA. So it was not until I was in my teens that I realised that her easy integration of these different parts of our story was not that common. I didn't realise, in fact, that the way she talked so frequently and so lovingly about her father and his experience was something that not every family felt they had the privilege and the luxury of doing. For that reason, the National Library has been really proud to be part of the telling of the stories and the remembering and the reflecting and the research that helps to reflect the whole breadth of experiences that make up the memory of Ireland. We say that our vision is to tell the stories of Ireland, and we are very mindful that those stories are much broader and deeper and more extensive than we're at some times allowed to be part of the national conversation. And we've been very proud to be allowed ourselves to be part of telling those stories. Over the last decade, we have reflected in a number of ways on the history of World War I and of the Irish regiments. We have had an exhibition focusing on the Irish experience of World War I. That exhibition is also available online. We have produced lectures, lecture series, seminars like this one. We have been very engaged in looking at innovative ways to engage, including through music and performance. And we were also involved in 2012 in a European-wide project to record the memories of World War I from individuals and to record their memorabilia, medals and letters and diaries and so on, that belonged to those who they knew or who they had loved who fought in the First World War. In 2012, as part of that project, we held a collecting day in the National Library of Ireland. And we were informed in our planning by our colleagues in Europe who had done a number of such days in the UK, in different countries, and in Germany. And they had said, in Berlin, where, for obvious reasons, the history of the First World War is also very contested, we had 150 people. So just be aware, you might have a very big crowd. You might have up to 150 people. On that day, 600 people turned up at the National Library of Ireland. It was extraordinary. There was a moment where I thought myself, perhaps I could just leave my job and run out the door now, because I'm not sure how we will accommodate all of these people. But it showed the volume of interest, of connection, and to my mind, the extent to which these events are not historic for very many people. They are actually a very lived part of their own family story, which is not that long ago at all. Very many people remember and love somebody who fought and who was part of that experience. And on that day, we had marvellous support from all kinds of people, but including Tom Burke, who has done such wonderful work and who've been privileged to work with throughout the years. And of course, my colleague Bridget Sullivan, who has set up all of the organisation of this event here today and who plays an absolutely extraordinary part in the work of the National Library. And I'd like to thank them both very, very much for everything they've done to bring us together today. Before concluding and handing over to our chair, I would just like to give you my apologies. I cannot stay for the rest of the seminar. It's my husband's 50th birthday, and given that we're talking about duties and obligations, I'm sure you will recognise that everybody has those. But I'm looking forward to the first session, and I'm very pleased to hand you over now to our chair. So this part of the seminar will be chaired by Lieutenant Colonel Andy Hart from the Royal Irish Regiment, and I'm very pleased to hand you over to Andy now.
Catherine. I'm neither an academic nor a historian. I spent 33 years as a soldier, and it's hard to believe that in this day, an officer of the Royal Irish Regiment is able to stand in this place and participate in a seminar that is going to discuss this topic, particularly given the name of the bar that sits over the road and the name of the street on which we sit. I was fortunate enough 4 years ago on the centenary of the armistice to participate in a similar seminar that looked at the Irish regiments up to and including just a little bit beyond the armistice, but then the continuity then. And I shared a platform then with Pádraig Yates, who's just snuck in at the back. And we discussed this phenomenal thing, this enigma that is the Irish soldier in the British Army during those years, and how it was had finally been dragged out from the roof space of history by people like Tom, who prompted everybody to go and fish around for their great-grandfathers and grandfathers' medals. And I think we are where we are today because of people like Tom and all of the others among you who have founded these new associations based on the old Irish regiments. As I say, I am a charlatan, and I simply think that I was slated for this job because I didn't move fast enough. Usual form in the regiment, that would mean you're a Gardens member, but here it means you're going to chair the first session. I'm afraid, reading their biographies, you have another couple of charlatans who are going to stand up as well. Dr. Pat, who's going to talk about the British regiments beyond the Great War and up until 1922, describes himself as a chemist. But if you can read through the rest of his biography, you'll see that he's patently not, as he describes himself now, he is a lapsed chemist and a very formidable authority in his chosen field. And likewise, our engineer, who is going to talk to us about the transition of a number of veterans of the Great War, having served with the British regiments in the Great War, who then made their way into the National Army in the new and nascent Free State of Ireland. So I am not going to take up any more of your time because I'm under very firm instructions from Tom to get this over and done with pretty rapidly. And by the way, I keep you on the clock. I'm going to hand you over to Pat.
I think an octopus would have a certain advantage in this situation, be able to hold the microphone, hold the pointer, hold the notes, and scratch your head at the same time. So, however, anyway, the twilight years, looking at the period 1919 to 1922. Now, there is no doubt about it. The British Empire did well out of the Treaty of Versailles. Absolutely very well. And if we look at a map of the British Empire in 1922, and I include, by the way, within the term empire, the self-governing dominions such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Crown colonies, League of Nations mandates, and even places like Egypt, which were technically independent, but were essentially governed by the British Empire. It had reached its greatest ever territorial extent. And that presented a whole series of problems for the British Army. Some of them could be described as the old problems, the traditional problems. India, protecting the Suez Canal, the imperial route to India, and war in Afghanistan. All of these resurfaced again. But you add to that a whole series of new problems. And you may be surprised, but I describe Ireland at that stage as a new problem. Because prior to 1916, you had over a century where Ireland was a source of recruits, a very nice place to maintain a garrison because it was cheaper than in the UK. And the only activity that the British Army had to indulge in was aid to the civil power, in particular helping in evictions during the Land War. So trouble in Ireland was a new problem and would become more and more the biggest ulcer that there was. But to add to that, you had the whole question of Middle Eastern oil. Because if you look at the map, you see that Iraq had become a mandate. And that was the source of oil, which was hugely important as the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy converted to oil from coal. But you had interventions in Russia. You had, as I say, the mandates in Palestine, Transjordan. You had former German colonies, such as in East Africa and in West Africa, to be at least have some garrison in there. You had forces of occupation. At one stage, Sir Henry Wilson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, envisaged a British army of occupation in Germany of not less than 350,000 men. Never got next or near anything like that. But he needed a force. And all of that against a fear of industrial unrest at home. And that was a very real fear in the government. Faced with militant trade unions, and bearing in mind that the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had all collapsed because of internal unrest. There was this fear. And for example, McCarthy, GOC Ireland, in 1921, was instructed to put 12 battalions of infantry on standby for transfer to England in case there was a general strike. So that was there in the background. Now, faced with those problems, the British Army had two issues, two problems in a sense. One was money, and the other was manpower. A brief word on the money question. The Exchequer, the Treasury, was determined to bring the British Army back to the good old days before the war. And when you adjusted for inflation, that meant a budget of about £80 million. In 1919, the budget for the army was £287 million. The actual expenditure was £425 million. There was a hell of a gap between 425 and 80, and the Exchequer would not let go. But critically, manpower. Pre-war, 250,000 regular troops. The height of the war, 3.8 million serving troops. And in 1917, the British Army started planning for demobilisation. And they planned it very carefully. Their idea was focus on the volunteers who joined up in 1914 and in 1915 before conscription. Keep those as the regular army. And all the new recruits, the new conscripts, these young guys, get rid of them. Big problem with that, it suited the army, but was blatantly unfair. because what the soldiers wanted was those who had served the longest would be the first to go. Exactly the opposite of what the planners in the army wanted. When they tried to implement their original scheme, there was a lot of unrest, some would call it mutinies, in the transit camps. So they very quickly got rid of that plan and went for the fairest days. Those who had served the longest were the first to go. And you can see then by 1919, the army was down to 1.6 million. A year later, 600,000. And it keeps on diminishing. Now, they needed soldiers. And the first thing that came to mind for the British Army was, let's get imperial contributions from Australia, from Canada, even from India, and we can use those in the Army of Occupations, etc. That meant with an absolute refusal from the Dominions. They wanted their boys home. So then, remarkably, in peacetime, the United Kingdom kept conscription for a further year, and that was politically very, very unpopular. They also reduced the enlistment age from 18 to 17, and they launched a huge recruitment campaign. Now, obviously, conscription did not apply in Ireland, but the recruitment campaign, and it's focused in on, let's see the world. No mention of fighting, no mention of imperial problems. This was going to be a paid holiday. See the world and get paid for doing it. Are you fond of travel? See the world at government expense by joining the army. And you had the same theme for the RAF. See the world, join the Royal Air Force. And all happy smiling faces. Did it work? It seems to have worked. Look at the regimental recruiting areas in Ireland. And you see there over 10,000 people joining up in that period. You had the traditional urban areas. You had the 83rd, including Belfast, for Antrim and Down. You had the 102nd, the Dublin Fusiliers, including Dublin. The traditional recruiting base for British soldiers was the urban unemployed. That was the traditional recruiting base. And it continued in there. The traditional rural areas, such as the Enniskillen Fusiliers with Donegal, etc., and the Connaught Rangers, the 88, rural areas of small farmers, traditionally had recruited very low levels of recruitment in those areas, and it continued. So you have the same pattern as pre-war in terms of area. And, as I say, quite a substantial number of recruits. But what about the quality? And the quality of the recruits is a recurring theme in British Army reports of the period. Henry Wilson, for example, inspected a battalion of the Black Watch in Cologne, and he noted in his diary, all very young, very raw, very untrained, and over 50% had never even fired a shot on the range. So this was, if you like, what was the result of the extension of conscription. Most of the British Army was made up of raw recruits, raw young conscripts. And McCarthy felt exactly the same about his troops in Ireland. And his correspondence with the War Office is rife with that. Untrained and being asked to take on duties in Ireland. But what about the Irish? Anecdotally, here's what McCann's, historian of the Munster, said. By this time, the battalion was up to strength in officers and over 900 strong in rank and file, for the latter had flocked back to the colours during 1919. The officers had seen service to a man and comprised as experienced and distinguished a body as the regiment has ever had at its disposal. At a time when an old soldier was hard to be met with in the new army, except for a few NCOs and employed men, the regiment found itself in the happy position of parading over 500 NCOs and men in one battalion with war experience. That's half the battalion. And that was remarkable in that. And you get that other areas. I calculated at one stage that in the 12 months ending the 30th of September 1921, the height of the Troubles, some 6,700 Irishmen joined, and of those, 3,000, 40% had previous war experience. They're coming back, they're joining the army. In a way, Bonham Carter of the Dublin Fusiliers summed it up slightly, perhaps more accurately. The battalion was a mixture of re-enlisted servicemen with war experience who, being good fellows and recruits, the latter included with youngsters a number of the worst sort of corner boys from Dublin. His words, not mine, on that. But the picture I'm trying to paint is a large number of re-enlistments. And there's no doubt about it, the evolving political and military situation in Ireland played its part. And there are references in the monthly reports by district inspectors of the RIC of people joining up, of enlistment being strong among the unemployed returned soldiers. Bear in mind that a lot of the guys who returned were demobilised. Their jobs had been kept for them in the railways, the banks, etc. Others had been unemployed when they joined up and they returned to unemployment. And these were prime targets for recruitment. And it's not just the Irish regiments. For example, the Devons in Waterford, the Devonshire Regiment, in their regimental history, they note a number of unemployed ex-soldiers from the city presenting themselves for enlistment and being taken on. So as I say, the picture is of experience, of quite a number of experienced soldiers. And one last sample, of the 60 or so men who were court-martialed as a result of the Connaught Rangers mutiny, almost half had previous service, were re-enlisting. Now, where did they serve? Everywhere except Ireland. They were involved, of course, in India. 6 of the regiments had battalions stationed there. In Egypt and in the Sudan, protecting the Suez Canal. None of them served in the latest war in Afghanistan. The reason being, the British forces were trying out a new policy, control without occupation. The primary service in that war in Afghanistan was the Royal Air Force, which tried, as I say, this idea of control without occupation, without troops on the ground. So if a village was proving awkward, not paying its taxes, the squadron bombed it. As an experiment, it didn't really work. But there were the new problems. Ireland, they couldn't serve there. They served in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, that's nowadays Iraq. They served with the intervention forces in Russia. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers was part of what was called the Black Sea Army for a period. In the mandates and in the forces of occupation in Germany. Now, Each one of those is a fantastic story, particularly the Army of Occupation and the one in Iraq, where you had the Royal Irish Fusiliers fighting their way up from Iraq, up through Iran, or Persia as it was called, all the way into the Caucasus, where it engaged briefly with Russian forces. Briefly. And then they had to fight their way all the way back down again to join in the force suppressing a major Iraqi revolt. All of those are safe own stories, but I'm just going to focus on two experiences, because I think, in a way, each of them is symbolic. The first is India and the experience of the Leinster Regiment. According to the regimental history, there were two outstanding events during the stay of the battalion in Madras: the visit of the Prince of Wales and the unrest in southern India, which culminated in what they call the Mopla Rebellion. India, in a way, was the spiritual home of the British Army. And 6 Irish battalions went back there. And for 5 of them, it was almost exactly the same as pre-war service in the cantonments. But the Leinsters had a different experience. The Moplas were a poor peasant people located on the southwest coast of India. They were Muslim. They claimed descent from Arab traders back in the 8th and 9th century. For centuries, they had been exploited by Hindu lords. They were the poor, they were the workers, approaching serfdom almost at times. And they occasionally rebelled against their Hindu overlords, and their rebellion was invariably suppressed very, very bloodily. The British Raj saw no reason to change that whatsoever. So when again the Moplas rebelled, they were always suppressed very bloodily. And in their rebellions, you had a terrible mixture of ethnicity, of religion, and of caste. In June 1921, they rebelled again. Virtually unarmed, using knives, clubs, they rebelled. The nearest European troops were 2 companies of the Leinster Regiment, stationed in Madras, under the command of a Captain McEnroy, who had been promoted from the ranks. He had been in the Irish Guards. He immediately mobilised just over half his men and led a column of 150 men towards one of the led them from Madras, where they were stationed, down towards a place called Tirangadi, which he identified as a centre. On the way, they were attacked by a couple of thousand Moplas, virtually unarmed. In the ensuing firefight, the Leinsters suffered no casualties. McEnroy claimed that he himself, with his rifle, had killed 30 rebels. And that set the pattern for the next 6 months. The remainder of the regiment, of the battalion, moved down from Madras and joined in these columns, patrolling, seeking out, and almost welcoming being attacked. They were supported by 2 other British battalions and by large numbers of the police forces, the Indian forces. And there's a lot of scenes like that, dead bodies on streets. In a way, it was almost a forerunner of the terrible slaughter that accompanied the partition of India. Because as I say, you had this mixture of ethnic of religious and of caste. The official figures on the government side, 43 combatants killed, only one of whom was a European from an English regiment, from the Manchesters, I think. 126 wounded. Officially, 2,339 rebels were killed, 1,652 injured, and 45,000 imprisoned. Unofficial estimates done later, particularly done after Indian independence, put figures as high as 10,000 deaths and 50,000 imprisoned, including 20,000 in a penal colony on the Andaman Islands. It was, in a way, the traditional suppression of rebellion. It was the last time that an Irish regiment was involved in suppressing rebellion. In that sense, it was almost the end of an era. But, as was said earlier on, it raises the idea. Here you have the men of the Leinster Regiment, drawn primarily from the Midlands, involved in suppressing rebellion, while their brothers, their cousins, their neighbours, their friends, back in Offaly and Laois, etc., may have been supporting the IRA. Now, the other main thing that happened to them was a visit in March 1922, just as the disbandment was being announced, of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, and later, very briefly, King Edward VIII. He's there in the centre of the front row there. And the regimental history gives far more space and detail to that visit than to the suppression of the Mopla rebellion. And over on the left, the far corner on the left, is Captain McEnroy. Remember, he claimed that single-handedly he killed 30 at the first engagement, and in total over 300 during the suppression of the rebellion, and for which he was awarded a DSO on that. So that, in a way, the last piece of suppression of rebellion by an Irish regiment. Now, the other area that I want to talk about is Germany, the Army of Occupation, and above all, the plebiscites. At the instigation of President Wilson, he insisted on a new concept at the time when they were drawing up the borders of countries: consult the people. Up to that, it was all done by the kings and by the prime ministers. Now, he insisted on writing in that the people should be consulted. Clemenceau and Lloyd George made sure that that only applied to the defeated nations. It did not apply to the victorious allies. But it applied in particular to Germany. And you can see there were 4 areas of dispute: Schleswig-Holstein, the Saar, an area called Allenstein over here, and above all, Silesia. Schleswig-Holstein was dead easy. The Danes, who were most of the northern half, voted to join Denmark. The Germans in the southern half. Very peaceful. A model, in a way, of you hold a plebiscite and you accept the results. The plebiscite in the Saar was postponed until 1935. Allenstein, South Prussia, the southeastern part of East Prussia, over there. That had a plebiscite in 1919. The Royal Irish Regiment was sent to police it. When it arrived in Allenstein, it noted that the German police, the local police force, German to a man, were equipped with armoured cars, heavy machine guns, artillery and trench mortars. Very handy for breaking up a pub fight or something like that. But they disarmed them without any resistance. The plebiscite was held in 1919 and resulted in a 98% vote to stay with Germany. The Poles did not object, partly because at the same time they were fighting the Russians at the gates of Warsaw. So that passed off very peacefully. The Royal Irish withdrew back to the Army of the Rhine, and as they left for the trains, they noted that the police were again equipped with artillery, armoured cars, heavy machine guns. But that passed off peacefully. A model. Silesia would be very, very different because it was a very wealthy province. It catered for a large part, over 25% of Germany's coal output, a large percentage of its iron and steel output, and it had a heavily industrialized area. The Allies, led by France, initially proposed transferring the whole lot to Poland. Poland argued that it needed the whole of Silesia to be economically stable to survive. On the other hand, the Germans argued that they needed Silesia to be able to pay for the reparations that were being imposed on them, an argument which appealed to the British. So there was a recipe for trouble, and in particular because the Germans were in a majority in the towns, and in the surrounding countryside, the Poles were in the majority. It was completely intermixed. Now, in 1919, you had an uprising in Silesia. In August, there was a strike at some of the coal mines, and the German police suppressed the strike, opening fire on demonstrating coal miners, killing 10 of them, the way they always suppress strikes in Silesia. The Poles rose up, armed by the new Polish government. German troops were not allowed into Silesia, but the Freikorps, these ex-soldiers operating as armed bands, intervened and suppressed the rising. The Poles who had risen up fled across the border to Poland and waited for the replay. The replay came a year later, almost to the date. On the 19th of August, word spread around Silesia that the Russians had captured Warsaw and that Poland as a country had collapsed. So they started victory parades. The Poles took exception and rioting ensued. It was stopped by the intervention of Allied military forces, French, Italian and British. That calmed the situation, but the British withdrew their troops very quickly. And the reason being, as Henry Wilson summarised it, if we are not careful, we shall lose Ireland. If we lose Ireland, we have lost the empire. Therefore, to me, as a military gentleman, there is for the moment only one theatre of any importance, Ireland, and I would personally crowd into Ireland every single soldier on whom I could lay my hands. And among these would be the 4 battalions down in Silesia, the 2 battalions in Constantinople, the 2 battalions in Palestine. And I use that as an example of the whole network. A problem in Silesia could not be solved because the troops were required in Ireland. And that was happening all the time. The influence of Ireland on the deployment of the British Army at the time could not be underestimated. Now, The plebiscite went ahead. It resulted in an overall majority of voters saying they wanted to stay in Germany, about 54%. 46% Poles wanted to join Poland. Make it worse, if you broke it down on a commune by commune basis, about 55% of the communes wanted to go with Germany, about 45 with Poland, but they weren't a clear line that you could draw. They were all intermingled. It will remind you almost of Churchill's famous description of the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, and and as Asquith, I think it once called it, the most God-given mixture of peoples and communities. You had the same problem. The British wanted simply to hand over to Germany. You go with the plebiscite. The French said no. You hand the whole lot over to Poland, with whom they were forming a very close alliance. And the compromise was partition. But where would the partition line be drawn up? And as well as that, the key question was the allocation of the industrial triangle. In anticipation that they might not get it, the Poles launched a pre-planned offensive. Regular Polish troops crossed over, entered Silesia, captured a lot of the industrial area. But the border police, the Grünschütz, and the Freikorps rallied, halted the Polish advance and forced them back. And that led to the creation of the Allied Upper Silesia military force. And Wilson again, last night the cabinet ordered me to send 2 more battalions in addition to those 4 that are going from the Rhine to Silesia. I have selected the Leinsters and the Connaughts, which I cannot employ in Ireland. In addition, I'm breaking up the 6 battalions to form 2 brigades. And if you look at the brigade structure, half it were Irishmen, half it were Irish units. The 2nd Leinsters, the 2nd Connaught Rangers, and the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish. So these were on a peacekeeping force. The plebiscite took place in March 1921, and in February, an Allied contingent, the 2 British brigades, a French division, and 3 Italian battalions arrived to supervise the voting. Although the situation was tense, polling day was peaceful, and the voting showed an overall majority of votes for Germany. The uneasy calm continued. In April, even though the Commission had not yet reported, all the troops were withdrawn to the Rhine. And that gave the Poles the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to intervene. The units entrained from the UK at the end of May, and by the first week of June were in position in Silesia. Force HQ was at Oppelin, and in a briefing that would sound familiar to later generation of Irish soldiers, the officers were told that their first duty would be to restore peace by interposing their troops between the warring factions, relying primarily on moral force. Physical force was only to be used in self-defence, and no favouritism was to be shown to either side. And as I say, exact same briefing will be taking place for Irish troops going to the Congo, Cyprus, etc., etc. That, in a way, was a foretaste of things to come for Irish soldiers. The key town of Rosenberg had been occupied by the Poles. On the 7th of June, the Leinsters were ordered to evict them. They approached the town, supported by a battery of artillery, and gave the Poles until 6 o'clock that evening to evacuate. By 5:30, there was no sign of movement. So the artillery was deployed, but at 5 to 6, the Poles began to withdraw. A real case of bluff, but they began to withdraw. And the Irish contingents settled down to a routine. There's the Leinsters arriving in Silesia, their headquarters at Byton, a border post, Polish troops at one end, Irish troops at the other, with a German border guard, keeping the peace between them. A typical one could be replicated to this day, checking papers at a crossing point. They were there for the winter, wasn't that comfortable. Colonel Jourdain, historian of the Connaught Rangers, wrote, "One began to see how the country people looked for justice to the British troops, and even how the French officers appreciated our presence in that distracted and strife-torn country. We were really neutral." And as I said, the impression was that the French favoured the Poles, the British favoured the Germans, and the Irish were in between. But, and he says, "the men of the Rangers, well commanded by the officers I had under me, showed firmness and impartiality, which was to bear good fruit during the coming months. The force commander, General Henniker, had a slightly different view. I find that some of our Irishmen have been egging the Germans on to attack the Poles in order to watch a good fight. I have had to issue a strict reminder to the troops, pointing out to them why we are here. But certainly it worked." And finally, when the commission, the Boundary Commission, reported, it gave an almost Solomon-like judgment. It drew a line, very, very crooked line, which gave about 85% of the territory to Germany, all with a German majority. But the bit that went to Poland contained about 70% of the mines and of the factories. That satisfied both. And as a result, the Irish withdrew. And there's a guard of honour of a French chasseurs d'Alpine company, guard of honour for the Connaught Rangers. Now, in the background at this stage was the whole question of disbandment. I come back to the question of money. The Geddes Commission had recommended very, very large reductions in the army. And one way of meeting them was to disband most of the Irish regiments. So for once, the political environment, the treaty with Ireland, the financial requirement to reduce the army, and the military requirement, troops were no longer required for Ireland. Those three factors coincided. And as forecast by the Royal United Service Journal, the wholesale disbandment threatened by the Geddes report may have to be met by the disappearance from the army lists of the greater number of our historic Irish regiments. And that forecast came true. March, just as the Prince of Wales was inspecting the Leinsters in India, the order was issued for disbandment. In the wind-up, options were given to the officers and men. Officers were offered the transfer to any one of 5 regiments that they could nominate. The men were offered transfer to any regiment. And in general, all of the officers, or virtually all of the officers, stayed in the British Army. About 20% of the other ranks, particularly the units stationed in India, opted to transfer to others. The balance opted to be discharged and to come home. There were some suggestions that the units might transfer to the Irish Army, but they got nowhere. Colonel Moore wrote to Michael Collins suggesting that the Connaught Rangers be transferred en masse to the new Irish Army. And I quote, he said, "They are best qualified of all the Irish regiments. They have recently mutinied." But even despite their mutiny, they were not transferred. And I just had then some photographs of the final disbandment. But as I say, I picked those two units, those two to show. One, the end of imperial policing. Secondly, this idea of peacekeeping. Because Silesia was the first time that British Army units had been deployed as a peacekeeping force under international control. And the Irish played a huge part in it. So with that, sorry Andy, I'll shut up.
Pat was very aptly described as a lapsed chemist. I'm very aptly described as a lapsed computer engineer. Spent all my career in the telecoms industry, but I had an opportunity to step away from that and go back to university and study something that I was very passionate about, which is military history. And I had the great privilege to do a master's degree in military history. And it was on the topic, and the thesis of my degree was on the topic of ex-British soldiers from these regiments and what's happened to them after they left, and did any of them end up in the Irish Army. And that's what I hope to talk to you about a little bit today. At the time, the Irish Army wasn't called the Irish Army. It was referred to as the National Army. And it kind of came into the public consciousness in early 1922 with events like this. And this is a detachment of the Irish Army marching in. I think this is Beggars Bush Barracks at the start of February 1922. And what had happened was that old people from the IRA, from the active Dublin Brigade of the IRA, you know, once the treaty with England had been agreed, with the UK had been agreed, they went out to Selbridge. They came out of the shadows, so to speak. They put on uniforms. About 50 of them learned how to march. They got some very nice uniforms, very well presented. And at the start of February, they came into Dublin by train to the Phoenix Park, and they marched through Dublin to take possession of Beggars Bush Barracks, which is very symbolic because I think that was where the auxiliaries had been based during the War of Independence. And to give you a little bit more context about them, you know, if you look at a little bit of a timeline of this whole Civil War period, you know, starting at the end of 1921 and going through 1922 and into 1923, conversations start talking about having an Irish army during the treaty negotiations, you know, between Ireland and England that would ultimately lead to the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And there was conversations about would Ireland have an army? And the Irish side of that were very, very set. Yes, they wanted to have control of their own security. They wanted to be responsible for their own security. And the army emerges, as I said, once that treaty is agreed. And the original plan for the army was it was going to be about 4,000 men in the army. Okay, they'd be made up of old, reliable men from the IRA who had fought during the War of Independence. When the Dáil ratifies the treaty, of course, things start to go wrong because that's a very, very contentious debate. Okay, and many people disagreed with signing the treaty. They felt that it wasn't full Irish independence. And very shortly, you start having a split in the Irish political situation. And ultimately that culminates around March, where about 60-70% of the IRA essentially decides that they're not going to follow the Dáil anymore. They're not going to agree to the treaty, and they go against the treaty. And as this is happening, you have the British forces are slowly withdrawing from different barracks all around Ireland. They're withdrawing initially from the smaller barracks to larger ones, and then back to Dublin. And those barracks are being taken over by different sides, either by the pro-treaty side or by the anti-treaty side. They're acquiring barracks, they're acquiring weapons that are left behind, and they're both recruiting. And so you have a situation by the start of June of 1922 where actually the anti-treaty IRA has about 13,000 armed men to somewhere 10,000 people in what's the pro-treaty side. Okay. So the anti-treaty side has more people, more weapons. Okay, they control a larger part of the country. And then we have the tragedy. You know, the forecourts have been taken over, I think, in April. At the end of June, the provisional government moves against them. There's terrible fighting in Dublin. The forecourts are destroyed. There's fighting for about a week, 10 days all around Dublin. And the Civil War really kicks off in earnest. And shortly after that, the provisional government issues, at the start of July, a national call to arms. And they said, look, this is an existential crisis for the new Irish state, and they need an army, and they need it quick. And they come up with a plan for an army of 35,000 men. I think 15,000 of them were going to be full-time soldiers, 20,000 reservists, but those reservists would be immediately called up for 6 months service. And they start recruiting. And they start recruiting all over the place. I think there's 5 recruitment centres in Dublin. But any Irish Army unit, and they start calling it now the National Army to distinguish themselves more clearly from the IRA. Any unit in any part of the country, if they think they can find good people, they can hire them, they can recruit them. By the end of August, there's 14,000 men in the Irish National Army. By the start of November, it's gone up to 33,000 men. Okay. And it's growing so quickly and so chaotically that they actually don't know how many men they have. So in November, they actually hold, on the 12th, the night of 12th, 13th of November, 1922, they hold a census to see how many soldiers are actually in the army. Okay. Who are they? Where were they hired? What's their next of kin? And lots of other details. Just to actually count, just because they really don't know how many people they have. And they end up with 33,000 men on that night. By the end of the year, it gets up to 38,000. And by the time the Irish Civil War ends, more than 50,000 men have served in the Irish Army. Okay. Some suggestions say it's up to about 58,000, including officers. And so this recruitment has gone on. It's very massive, it's very decentralized, and it's very chaotic. While all this has been going on, as Pat alluded to, the British regiments, you know, the 5 regiments from the British Army that were raised in the south of Ireland, are all being disbanded, and all these men are being discharged. Once the negotiations on the Anglo-Irish Treaty kick off, the British Army suspended recruitment into the southern regiments. So no new guys are being hired. And it becomes very clear during the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations in London that the Irish side has no interest in taking these regiments into Irish service. You know, they want their own army built their own way. And the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty is kind of the death knell of the regiments. At the start of 1922, there's a little over 8,000 men in them across the 5 regiments. By end of March, there's a formal decision to disband them. And these regiments, who are all serving outside of Ireland, are being brought back to the UK, and the men start to be discharged. So in May, June, July, they're all actually discharged. By the end of July, they're all gone. And so those 5 regiments are going this way, while the Irish Army is going this way. And so what we were looking at in the research we did was to see, was there a changeover here? Did some of these former British soldiers come out of the British Army, change uniform, redefine their loyalties, and serve Ireland in a different way? And we know they were wanted. There's a quote from Richard McCarthy, who had served in multiple different roles within the IRA and within the Republican movement, and was eventually become commander of the National Army after Michael Collins died. And he's quoted as saying that he wanted the best of the disbanded British regiments to be brought into the new National Army, provided they could be broken up and provided that any stigma associated with us hiring them can be avoided. I think it's an interesting word in the context of what we're doing. They wanted to avoid a stigma of bringing them in. So basically, this is what we did, and we started looking to see, did some of these ex-British soldiers end up in the Irish Army? And so I started asking ourselves some key questions. And we know there were a lot of British soldiers in the National Army. Okay, there's been some great research done by people like Jane Leonard and others to suggest that a very large proportion of people in the National Army on the pro-treaty side of the Civil War had seen previous service in the British military, maybe up to 30, 40, 50% of the enlisted men, and maybe even 20% or something like that of the officers had seen service. But we were curious about particularly these Irish regiments, and particularly the guys who had served in that post-war period. Because as Pat said, these guys chose to go and enlist in the British Army while the War of Independence is being fought at home here in Ireland. So kind of, they've elected to do this at a very unusual time. So that was the first question we're trying to set out and to see could we address that. The anti-treaty side in the Civil War were in any civil war, it's a very dirty thing, and it is both a physical conflict, but it's also a psychological conflict. And a lot of the anti-treaty propaganda was very contemptuous of the National Army. They referred to them as the green and tans, and they were trying to taint them with the associations with, the black and tans, maybe trying to, cast doubts as to their loyalties to Ireland, cast doubts as to their origins. So we were curious to find out who were these guys. During the First World War, up to 30% of the people, of the men who had served in these regiments weren't Irish. They had come from other parts of the UK. So we wanted to know who were these guys and what can we learn about them, as people and as soldiers. And then the final thing we wanted to find out was, what did they do? What was their contribution? Did they make an impact? Okay. And that's what we set out to try to research. And to try to address that first question, we had to find ex-British soldiers who'd ended up in the Irish Army. And we had a brilliant asset here in that census records. So that census that had happened of the Irish Army in the night of the 12th, 13th November 1922. And it happened at some nearly 300 posts around the country. And every soldier who was there was required to fill in an entry. Okay. And that captured a huge amount of detail about who was there in the army, at least in November 1922. We also had very, very fortunate in that the National Army Museum in the UK had taken the enlistment books for the 5 disbanded regiments, and they had scanned them and put them up online and made them available. And so you have a complete record of all of the soldiers who served in those regiments during the post-war period. And there's 12,000 men in there. And some of those men are people who were new recruits, who responded to the inducements to come and travel the world and see exotic places and be paid for it. And some of them were Great War veterans who had re-enlisted. Okay. But provided they were serving between mid-1919 until the regiments were disbanded, they would have been captured in this. And essentially what we were doing in the research was looking at each of these 12,000 men, and trying to see did any of them appear in the Irish Army census. And I and a very good colleague of mine, Dr. Ruthven Hanrahan, who I'd worked with in the IT industry over many years, worked to try to write some computer programs to go search for these guys. And when we found them, so we did a search based on name and age. So, can you find someone, if it's Patrick Murphy, age 22 in the British Army, can you find a Patrick Murphy, age 22, or approximately that age in the Irish Army? And you, funnily enough, you'll find hundreds of Patrick Murphys, age 22 in the Irish Army. Who knew? But then what we did is we went and looked at other details about them, and particularly their addresses and the addresses of their next of kin. Okay, and could we actually find a match? And actually, that worked very well. And we did actually start finding lots of matches. And when we found a match, we actually had a great opportunity, because we were able to take their Irish Army records and their British Army records and combine them together. And you get a much richer picture of who these men were, okay, because different things were quartered in different places. So where did they go? This is a picture of Dublin Fusiliers. I think this is taken about 1915. And some of these men wouldn't have still been in the army, some of them were. As I said, there was about 12,000 men in those 5 regiments during the post-war period. And there was 8,000 of them still in service at the start of 1922. And when the regiments were being disbanded, some of them transferred to other units of the British Army, about 1,800 in total. And pretty much all of the officers went, a lot of the senior NCOs, okay, the sergeants, the sergeant majors, the senior NCOs were transferred to other British infantry regiments. But notwithstanding all of that, there's about 6,300 of them that gets discharged from the British Army. And they're all discharged with 28 days pay. Okay, they're furloughed actually. So most of them aren't actually discharged. They're saying, okay, you're now in the reserves. And we want to know where you're going to go, because we might want to call you up again in future. But they're given 28 days pay. They're all discharged at different locations around the UK. So again, they were coming home from abroad. They came to places like Portsmouth, and they were discharged there, or Plymouth. Some went up to Hamilton in Scotland and were discharged there. Warwick, Tidworth, a number of other places. Okay. But by November, about 1,100 of them have come back to Ireland and have joined the Irish Army. And we could actually track these guys because of the addresses they gave. Okay. And most of them joined the Irish Army very quickly. Okay. Of the ones who had left the British Army in 1922, most of them joined the Irish Army within 7 weeks. About a third joined it in less than 4 weeks. So you get this real picture of the lads getting out of the British Army, and they have their 4 weeks' pay, and they spend it, and then they join the Irish Army. But some couldn't join it. Some came back to places in Ireland that were under control of the anti-treaty forces. There was no National Army Recruitment Depot there because the IRA was there instead. And we came across lots of people who joined up on the day a particular town was taken by National Army forces. And in the summer of 1922, the National Army, takes places like Limerick, it takes towns like Waterford, and it moves around by ship and takes places like Fionnuala and Tralee, it takes Cork, it takes Youghal, other towns like that. And as you go through the records, you find people like who joined the National Army the day the National Army gets to town. So the day the National Army lands in Youghal on the 8th of August, you guys like Christopher Fitzgerald, who was 18, who had served in the Munster Fusiliers, and he joined that morning. The same morning the Irish Army gets to town, he comes and joins. And he's an interesting guy. He was only 18. He had joined the army in August of 1921. He was discharged in May of 22. And his next of kin address was very remarkable. It was care of the master's office at Youghal Workhouse. So you wonder what kind of background he came from there. Excuse me. So where did they come from? I mean, one of the questions we wanted to find out is, where were these guys? Who were they as people and as soldiers? And again, as I mentioned, during the Great War, about 30% of people who had served in the Irish regiments weren't Irish. One of the things that struck us very quickly, 97% of the guys, of those 1,100 men who joined the Irish Army from the British Army, 97% of them were born in Southern Ireland, in the 26 counties. Okay. But the rest were born in the north, about 1.5%. The rest were born in the UK. These are overwhelmingly Irish guys. And they came from all over the country. That's a little table, it would be impossible to read now, but it's where they came from across the country and relative to the population according to the 1911 census. And there's some counties that are overrepresented and some counties that are underrepresented. The ones in green are a little bit overrepresented, the ones in pink are underrepresented. And kind of unsurprisingly, you have places like Dublin, Cork, Tipperary, Limerick, that have a strong tradition of recruitment, are strongly represented. Some of the counties further down, the ones in pink, they're not strongly represented. And partly that is because these are where recruits that have gone to other regiments, the regiments that more traditionally associated with Northern Ireland, like the Inniskill and Fusiliers. One place that sticks out is my wife's home county of Kerry, where it was distinctly underrepresented. And maybe that's to do with the degree of violence that was happening there during the Civil War. We also went looking at where did they come from in terms of an urban-rural split. And this was something that kind of strongly, I suppose in some ways, surprised me. They're overwhelmingly townies. I come from rural County Kilkenny, and the local town is Carrick-on-Suir, which is across the border in County Tipperary, is 8 kilometres away. And I'm very distinctly a Culchie, okay? Whereas the lads who come from Carrick-on-Suir, they're townies, okay? They'd be quite distinct. A huge number of these guys came from, again, as you'd expect, places like Dublin City, places like Cork City, the maybe more traditional garrison towns. But a huge number of them came from small towns throughout Ireland. Okay. Like 3/4 of these guys are town folk. And you can see it from the addresses. The addresses are very, very precise. Okay. Because that was where your call-up papers would go to if they wanted you back from the reserves. That was where any pension would be sent to. That's where next of kin would be informed if there was something, if you passed away, if you died, whatever. So the addresses are very specific. Most of these addresses that are there, you could put into an air code finder and it'll give you an air code today. They're still valid addresses today. Overwhelmingly urban. And what can we learn about them as people? Well, The average age was 21. Very young. Now, we found out there's really two demographics here. There's lads who joined up after the war, who were new enlistments, and there's people who had also served during the war. People who had served in the war, they were older, obviously, about 26. They're largely single. They're not married. Okay, 85% of them were single. Again, some of the older men would have been married. Okay, but even so, the majority were single men. And one of the interesting things about the two sources, the British and Irish records, was they recorded different things. The Irish records recorded religion. So the Irish Army wanted to know what religion you were. They were 99% Roman Catholic. Okay. The British Army recorded something which is possibly more useful, which is what had you done before you joined the army? What was your occupation? And 78% of these guys are labourers. Okay. Labourers are semi-skilled. So they're farm labourers, they're dockers, they're lads who use their muscles to make money. Okay, they're there's very few lads there who have a skilled trade, who have got a skilled occupation. Okay. And most of these guys didn't have a great education. They joined up aged 18 or 19, and they have already been working for several years. In all of the records we looked at, we came across one person who joined as a schoolman. Okay, who joined direct from school. So all these guys had finished what little education they got, and had spent several years making money somehow or another until they were old enough to join the army. And again, for someone like that, the appeal of come join the army, see the world, and get paid for it was very important. Most of these guys they're private soldiers. Their rank in the British Army is private, or it's fusilier. They're private soldiers. All of the senior NCOs, all the officers, they have stayed in the British Army. But about more than a third of them, have seen service in the Great War. Okay, in one or more listed and identified campaigns. Okay, and they've been in places like, they've been with the BEF in France, they've served with the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force in Gallipoli and Salonika, they've been with the Egyptian Expeditionary Force in Palestine. 8% of them have been wounded in action. Because our British records record, that they have a gunshot wound or a shrapnel wound, and where it was. They were being recorded so that if there was a later pension application, you could say, the guy he was shot in the arm, and that's why he deserves a pension. And a lot of them have received decorations. Huge number of them have this medal, which I think is the British War Medal. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. And a lot of them have different campaign medals. Some of them, though, have been, more significant medals. We came across a gentleman, Nicholas Nevin, who was in the Royal Irish Regiment. He was from Kilkenny. And he'd served 4 years in France, won the military medal there. He'd been shot twice. He had a gunshot wound in the scalp in February of 1916. Recovered from that, went back to the front, was shot again in the shoulder in June of 1916. He just wasn't having a good run of it. And he comes out of the Irish Army, or out of the British Army as a private, but by November of 1922, he's a company sergeant major in the Irish Army. This guy knows how to be a soldier. Okay, he's served, he's seen a lot. He's a very valuable asset for the Irish Army. We came across another gentleman, James Walsh from Kilkenny, again in the Royal Irish Regiment, and he'd served in France and he served in Palestine, he served in Salonika. He got the DCM while serving in the British Army. And again, he comes out of the British Army a private, he turns up in the Irish Army as a sergeant. Okay, these are guys who are a lot of experience. The lads who'd served during the war have about 6 years military experience. The guys who came along after the war had about 2 years. On average, across those 1,100 guys who joined the National Army, it's 4 years of military service. That's a lot of service. So if you actually take that 4 year service times 1,100 guys, that's 4,400 man years of military experience that joined the Irish Army in a matter of weeks. In the summer of 1922. And again, these guys had experience in places, as Pat said, like India. A lot of them would have had this clasp here, the Malabar clasp, okay, to record that service that they had given there. So the third question we set out to ask ourselves is, what was their contribution to the Irish Army? And probably first and foremost is that they were experienced soldiers, So that's a picture of British Army soldiers in Palestine in 1918 at a place called Arash. These aren't actually Irish soldiers. I couldn't find an appropriate photo, but they would have been serving with them. Okay. They're experienced soldiers. They have been through a lot during the war. They've served in different parts of the empire. As Pat said, they served in Silesia. They served in the Rhineland. They'd served in Egypt, they served in Constantinople. Okay. And they brought a lot of that experience into the Irish Army. And they are infantry soldiers, so they're familiar with the weapons that the Irish Army would have given them. So the Irish Army used exactly the same weapons as the British Army would have used. We would have been using things like the Lee Enfield rifle, we've been using things like the Lewis guns, etc. So again, they would have been experienced with that. But they also would have had specialist skills, that they acquired along the way. The photo of a gentleman operating a radio is a British Army radio operator. Okay, but as you go through these records, you find, people like Christopher Mooney, and he was a gentleman. He was in the Leinster Regiment. And he served in France from 1914 until 1919, okay? And again, he leaves the British Army as a private. By November 1922, he's in the Irish Army. He's a sergeant, okay? But he's now in the Signal Corps. So somewhere along the way, he had learned something that was useful about telegraphy or wireless telegraphy, we're not sure, and had brought that experience with him into the new Irish Army. Similarly, you have people, that's an Irish Army artillery team. I think that's the photos taken in Cork in the summer of 1922, in August 22. And the gentleman directing that gun looks like he knows what he's doing. Okay, I can't tell for sure. But again, as you go through the records, you find that these guys, not only were they serving in the infantry, but they'd also served in other places. You find lads who'd served in the machine gun corps, in the tank, with tanks. You find people who have served in the Royal Army Service Corps, so they have some experience and knowledge of logistics. They're bringing all these specialist skills into the Irish Army with them. These two very formidable looking gentlemen are senior NCOs in the Dublin Fusiliers. I think this photo is from the war years. I think it's 1915 or 16. And they're very formidable looking gentlemen. I mean, I think I would follow their instructions. I mean, I don't think I'd mess with them. These guys did not come across into the Irish Army. If they had survived the war and if they had stayed in service, more than likely they transferred into other British regiments. But the privates and the junior NCOs, the lance corporals, the corporals that left behind, who did transfer over to the Irish Army, they stepped up. And something like 20% of the guys who transferred across got promoted. So they leave the British Army as a private, but you come back in November 22 and they become a sergeant in the Irish Army. Okay. They become sergeants. Corporals in the British Army have become sergeant majors. and you got this stepping up. And the Civil War was a very diverse affair. The census of 1922 had the Irish Army at some 300 posts around the country. And so this wasn't a war of generals or senior commanders. It was all about small units. It was, people who know how to command a squad, people who know how to command a platoon. And that senior leadership was absolutely key. And a lot of that senior leadership came from people who came out of the British Army and came into the Irish Army. The other thing they brought across was instructors. And one thing we found again and again was ex-British soldiers acting as instructors for the Irish Army in places like the Curragh. Okay. And we came across a number of very interesting people. One gentleman we came across was William Burland, and he'd been in November 1922. He was a company quartermaster sergeant in the Irish military police stationed in the Curragh, which was a very interesting turn of events because he'd been discharged from the Connacht Rangers as a mutineer. So kind of, poacher turned gamekeeper, whatever. And we came across a lot of guys there who were acting as instructors for the new Irish Army because it's a desperately undertrained army. There's something like 780 Irish soldiers in the National Army killed during the Irish Civil War. And a huge number of them, something like more than 20%, were killed through mishandling their own weapons. Okay. Shooting themselves or shooting a colleague accidentally. Not friendly fire, but just an accidental discharge of a rifle in the barrack room or the billet you're staying in. They were woefully undertrained. There's lots of anecdotal stories of National Army soldiers learning the mechanism of a Lee Enfield rifle on the way to a fight. Okay. And, someone who has experience, someone who has done on average 4 years military service, has some level of experience. Okay. And they brought that with them into the Irish Army. And a lot of them, as I said, are serving as instructors. And again, interestingly, we came across lots of them who are still on their pension from the British Army while serving as an instructor in the Curragh. But not all of them. Something's just gone off screen. Not all of them brought good things to the army. There's a lot of misfits there as well. There's guys who've been discharged from the British Army for numbers of offences. There are people who've been discharged from the British Army, care of His Majesty's Prison Service, i.e. they've been sent to prison. There's guys who've been discharged from the British Army because they're medically unfit for service, yet they turn up a few weeks later in the Irish Army. There are guys who, the British Army had a probation system. So a soldier was brought into the British Army, and after 60 or 90 days, if the regiment didn't think they were going to make it as a soldier, they'd be discharged. And they had a wonderful phrase to say that this soldier has been discharged as he's unlikely to become an efficient soldier. Loads of these guys who've been discharged because they weren't going to become an efficient soldier in the British Army, they end up in the Irish Army. So you have these misfits as well, these guys who were discharged for one or other reason, for health reasons, for whatever, but they all end up in the Irish Army because the Irish Army needs those men and they need them in strength. But overall, these guys make a huge contribution.
Arthur, I think we're going to have to skip your stories because we're
okay, very quick, no worries. These are three guys I came across, and give me 2 minutes, I'll rattle through these. These guys appear in British Army records, they appear in the Irish Army census, and then they generally just disappear. And three guys I came across I just want to bring your attention to, who appear in the Irish Army pension stories. One's a guy called James Duffy. He had served in the Leinster Regiment He had joined the National Army, and he doesn't appear in the census because he was already killed in action with the National Army on the Mall in Castlebar. He was manning a picket, and he came under fire from a local churchyard, and he was shot several times. And by the time his comrades could get him to the local hospital, he had died. James McCarthy from Limerick, and he joined the Royal Munster Fusiliers during the war. I think he was 16, and he left the army. He'd served in the Western Front, left the army in 1921, and he joins the Irish Army, becomes a sergeant major, a machine gun instructor. When he was killed in Wexford in February 1923, under rather unusual circumstances. And seemingly he had been in the habit of taking his Webley service revolver and putting it in his mouth. And he had done this multiple times, and he'd been out socializing and had done this, and the gun had gone off. And his mother applied for a pension, and the Irish Army refused the pension because he had contributed to his own debt. Okay. And again, maybe a more modern reader looking at this would say, a teenage veteran of the Western Front, who has a habit of putting a revolver into their mouth, is this someone who might need some help or some assistance, or is there post-traumatic stress or whatever, But anyway, that was his story. John Gannon was a pre-war soldier. He came from Portarlington, County Laois, and he joined the Connacht Rangers in 1911. He served throughout the war. He was wounded twice. Discharged as a private in 1919, he goes home to Portarlington and he marries. He was working as a farm labourer. And according to his wife, he joined the National Army because even though he's getting £1 a week as a farm labourer, and even though the Irish Army was only offering him £1 a week, at least it was steady money. And it was a regular money that he'd get every week rather than the occasional, working as a casual labourer. And he's serving in the Irish Army locally in Portlaoise, and he's on with his unit, and they're doing a sweep, they're doing a search of a farmhouse near Derry 4, not far from Portarlington, when they come across some IRA irregulars. There's a firefight. He gets shot in both legs. And he dies after 20 minutes, suggesting, death from blood loss and shock. And that happened on the 25th of April, 1923. 2 days later, Frank Aiken, who was then the commander of the irregulars, issues an instruction to cease offensive operations, essentially a ceasefire. So he essentially died. He's probably one of the last, not the last, but he's one of the last National Army soldiers to die during the Civil War. Okay. Within a month, the IRA dumps arms and the Civil War is over. And again, the thing about all three of these, they all died in the service of the Irish state. They all died wearing an Irish Army uniform, serving Ireland. Some very quick conclusions. I mentioned earlier Richard Mulcahy. He had wanted these men in the Irish Army, and he got his ask. They were there in strength. Okay, they were broken up, and he managed to avoid the stigma of their involvement. They were largely very poor, urban Irish Catholic men. Okay, nothing special about them. Okay, the only thing you'd add to that is say they were young and single as well, which is probably pretty common in most armies. But they were also very experienced soldiers, and they brought a lot to that Irish Army, along with other ex-British servicemen and along with people from the IRA, and made that army what it is today. And I think they have been forgotten and badly treated because we have an amnesia in Ireland as to, ex-British servicemen and the fact that Irish people serve in British forces. And we also have an amnesia about the Civil War. We don't want to talk about it. It wasn't even taught in the schools until I think the 1960s and 1970s. So these guys are affected by a double amnesia. We have forgotten about it. And again, hopefully today, this seminar will do something to address that. And again, thanks to Tom for organising. Okay.
My name is Gerard Buckley. I'm a serving member of the Defence Forces. I hold the post of our military representative to the European Union, which means I sit in the European Union Military Committee, and I also lead the Defence Forces team, which is out at NATO headquarters. We're members of Partnership for Peace. In relation to military history, I'm not going to call myself a charlatan. But I will admit to being an enthusiastic amateur with a very patient wife. And my primary achievement in military history has been to enrich my local bookshop by buying most of their offerings. One of the great benefits of living in Belgium, and I've been there for the last 3 years, has been proximity to the battlefields. And as I said, a very patient wife who lets me indulge in the odd day. And I've spent many happy hours, days even, around Ypres and in the Somme and other parts of France. And I must particularly thank Tom for his guidebook on the Battle of Messines Ridge. It provides a fascinating insight. And I've been up and down the lanes there many a time. But also from my official duties, I have a role in participating in the commemorative events, and I do that very willingly. I recently participated in the anniversary of the Battle of Mons, the 23rd of August, and I was down on the Somme in July at the Ulster Tower in Thiepval, and it's an important aspect of the reconciliation process for the Defence Forces to participate in these events. But what really drew me to today's seminar was the fascinating linkages between the disbandment of the British Army and the emergence of the National Army, which has evolved into Óglaigh na hÉireann, the Defence Forces, the army that I have served in for many years, and I've been particularly fascinated by what I've heard this morning so far, and look forward to finding out even more about that whole aspect of our history, which isn't particularly well developed in the public narrative. This afternoon, as I said, we're going to have 3 excellent speakers. We have Dr. Emmanuel Destiny coming from Paris, virtually. I'm told it's pre-recorded. Very smart, Tom. Most of us would have gone with the VTC, which would, without any doubt, have failed at some stage. And he talks about the transition of the National Army, of the veterans into the National Army, where their experience was clearly prized. But ironically, outside of the army, and perhaps inside the army as well, they face discrimination and prejudice. Then Tom, our host, takes us further into the experiences of the returning veterans and will present to us the many challenges they faced across Irish society. And finally, best wine until last, Dr. Fionnuala Walsh from UCD, and she's going to talk about the impact of war beyond the battlefield. And we all know that war doesn't end at the battlefield, and inevitably it had a direct impact on Irish women and their families, who were often left to pick up the pieces. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerard, for coming along today, and Andy. So we'll talk later. Now, in 2013, a lady from the Not Forgotten Society in Dublin contacted me telling me she had thousands of postcards and some files containing personal information on World War I ex-servicemen and women who lived in the Republic of Ireland. Most of the files had sadly been destroyed. She was about to destroy the cards and asked if I wanted them. Naturally, I took them and spent many years after she'd given them to me logging that data that was contained in the cards into my computer. Now, the Not Forgotten Society was a sort of St. Vincent de Paul of British ex-service personnel in the Irish Republic. They were originally the joint committee of the Dublin branch of the Red Cross and the Irish district of the St. John's Ambulance Brigade, established not long after the war broke out in 1914. The joint committee's charity work continued up to March 2002 as the Not Forgotten Society. The information contained on the cards revealed an insight into the lives of thousands of Irish World War I veterans who shared one thing in common: they had all fallen on hard times at one stage in their lives and applied for charity for help to the Not Forgotten Society. But like a jigsaw, the information contained on one card was not very revealing. However, assembling the pieces together resulted in a very interesting picture, presenting a very tragic story, some of which I hope to tell you now in the next few minutes. The total number of cards I have logged into my computer was 7,904. The sample I analysed was 6,805 World War I ex-service personnel whose surnames began with the letters A, B and C. I'm almost through the letter D. So that's 3 letters I've done, and I've nearly 8,000 names. I'm going to be at this for the rest of my life, as you can see, folks. But anyway, there's 2 cards up there you can see displayed. Now, the kind of information that was contained in the cards was the name and address. First example I gave is Michael Carr from Urlingford, County Kilkenny. He served in the Enniskilling Fusiliers and the Royal Irish Regiment. He had no pension, suffered from gunshot wounds, was in the mental hospital in Kilkenny, and he received £30 until he died in 1960. John Boland from Limerick served in the Leinster Regiment. He was killed, stroke murdered, pick one, whatever one you like, by the IRA in June 1921. His widow was awarded £10 from the Limitless Fund from the Society. It also gives the regiment in which the man served or woman served. As I said, there were 6,805 served in the First World War. 42 of them served in the Boer War and World War I. 84 of them served in World War I and World War II. 70 women I found served as VADs in the Red Cross or Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. One woman I discovered recently was a Mrs. Lily Duggan, a munitions worker for 46 Portland Row. She had 10 children, and in 1921 was given £5 from the Society for her children. There's personal details on topics such as employment, marriage status, family and children, pension details, the kind of disabilities the man had or the woman had, the sources of help that these people were given from the Society and people like the British Legion, the kind of assistance they were given, such as food, clothing, medical and fuel, and occasionally things like details of death, cause of death and the year of death. So that's the first thing we're going to do is look at the numbers. Now, folks, the tables have been pitting here all day. I'll give it to you later on if you want the data out of the tables. But the thing about it is, that table there shows the number of people who I have so far who came from Dublin, 31%, 20% from Cork. If you go down even further into the Dublin district, this sort of ties in what everybody's been saying so far about, poor employed. 28% from the Dublin 8, 18%, 19% from Dublin 1. And these are the post-statistic percentages tie in really with the previous research that I'd done on Dublin Fusiliers, World War I casualties, who came from the same postal districts. Essentially, they left the tenement life in 1914 and they returned to the tenement life when the war ended. Now I can give these numbers out, folks, at the end of the lecture. Now, the tables show the ex-service personnel living in Dublin 1 and Dublin 8. Also included are Dublin Fusiliers men killed who lived on the same street. However, these casualty numbers do not include, and I have that underlined, do not include men who served in other units. So the number of British servicemen and women who lived on these streets will be higher. Okay? In Dublin 8, for example, Francis Street had 18 ex-service families. 11 families who served in the Dublin Fusiliers were killed. In Dublin 1, Summerhill had 27 ex-service families, 9 RDF men killed in the war. And if you drill down even further into those numbers, what you'll find is that ex-service personnel living alongside each other. For example, Hugh Doyle from 119 Cambrazza Street served in World War I and World War II with the Royal Irish Rifles and the Royal Ulster Rifles. Next door to him was at 120 Clanbrassil Street was Thomas Birch, ex-Royal Navy, and at 121 was the widow of John Byrne, ex-Royal Army Service Corps. John Carter, age 19, Thomas MacDonald, age 30, all lived at number 12 Golden Lane. Next door at number 13 was Andrew Moore. Those three men were killed serving with the Dublin Fusiliers. There were ex-servicemen living in the same tenement house as each other. John Cunningham served in the Surrey Regiment. John Ahern served in the Leinster Regiment. Thomas Buckley in the Royal Irish Fusiliers. Patrick Bulger in the Royal Army Service Corps. All four of them lived at number 27 Golden Lane off Bride Street in Dublin. There were men who recorded with no fixed addresses on the cards. They lived homeless. Out of 2,150 who lived in Dublin, only 62 in the Ivy Trust and Molyneux House at Peter Street. 77 lived in more than 3 places. And it was a way of me being able to if I recorded a man who lived in 3 or 4 places, it was kind of an indication of his instability, that he, if you had a house, you're stable. So essentially they came from this between the canals, and the economy of which the post-war years was very much dependent on British military pensions and British funded charities. Pre-1922, the greatest threat to British ex-servicemen in Ireland, in my opinion, was not the shadow of an IRA gunman, but the shadow of unemployment. And Emmanuel has mentioned it early on. In 1920, demobilised servicemen in Britain amounted to 3,365,000. In Ireland, it was 83,500. Unemployed ex-servicemen in Britain was 311,000, or 9%. In Ireland, it was 27,000, or 31%. Of the ex-servicemen. Unemployment among ex-servicemen in Ireland was approximately 4 times higher than it was in Britain. There are some reasons for this anomaly. First of all, obviously enough, the country was in turmoil. The Irish economy was mainly agriculture, and as I've shown, the majority of ex-servicemen were urban dwellers. Apart from jobs in beer and biscuits, there was few opportunities for work in the cities and towns. The King's National Roll, where large employers employed wounded veterans from a national roll, was adopted in Britain in 1919. The scheme did not work in Ireland. One reason given was the trade unions' objections on the grounds that the scheme gave favouritism to British ex-servicemen. The British response to unemployment up to 1922 was piecemeal. The British Ministry of Labour provided training schemes created around the country. For example, in Clonmel Technical School there was men trained as blacksmiths and carpenters. In Dublin's Hume Street, where men were trained in watchmaking and clock repair. There was also the Lord Roberts Funds at 26 South Frederick Street in Dublin. However, the training schemes again were totally inaccurate. In Tipperary, 3,900 ex-servicemen applied for training, only 163 got places. However, not all was doom and gloom. James O'Brien from Thomastown served in the Royal Army Service Corps and got £80 of a grant in 1920 from the King's Fund for the purchase of straps for harness making. And I'd like to thank Bernie Egan of the Kilkenny War Society for that, for her great-grandfather. Men in banks and Jacobs Biscuits got their pre-war jobs back, as has been said. About 540 men returned to their jobs in Guinnesses. Post-1922, the British had no obligation for employment of ex-servicemen in the Irish Free State. The issue of unemployment and resulting destitution among British ex-service personnel in the Irish Free State came to a head in 1927 when the Cosgrave government commissioned the Labour Committee set up to examine, among other things, allegations of discrimination in state employment schemes. A case example was Daniel Sline from Inniskeen, County Cork, who wrote to the Labour Committee on the 23rd of January 1928. He enlisted in the Irish Guards in 1915, and I quote, in response to a personal appeal by the British Postmaster General, Mr. Herbert Samuels, end quote. He applied to get his job back in the post office. He was threatened and, quote, told that ex-British soldiers are a thing of the past. My chances of securing an established appointment are now nil. As with the change of government, vacancies will only be given to telegraph messengers who are ex-National Army men, end quote. And yet, Edward Cuthbert from Dublin Road in Dundalk, ex-Royal Field Artillery, worked as a postman, earning £3 a week beginning in 1930. He had some other temporary work with Major Carew of Castlebellingham as a groom. Nothing much came of the Lavery report. The recession in the 1930s didn't help, with unemployment in the Free State running to between 90 and 100,000. Unemployed British ex-service personnel in the 1930s did not have the monopoly on the misery of unemployment. They suffered the same fate as their unemployed fellow citizens, and I want to get that underlined for. They didn't have the monopoly on misery. For example, but anyway, if capable of working, the majority of the men that I found in the sample that I've been studying had jobs, well, but the vast majority were in fact menial. For example, William Carston from Sandy Row in Belfast, ex-Royal Irish Rifles, World War I and World War II, worked in Dublin between the wars, quote, with a circus whose business had failed, end quote. Miss Frances Broderick from Monkstown, County Dublin, she served in the Queen Alexandra Imperial Medical Nursing Services, and after the war, she got a job with the Royal United Kingdom Beneficent Association. William Loftus from Borris O'Kane, Tipperary, served in the Irish Guards. He got a job with North Tipperary County Council and worked with them for most of his life. He died in 1972. Dennis Donnelly from Carrow in County Galway also was in the Irish Guards, and he got a place in the Garda Síochána. Now, the sources of help that the ex-servicemen got, the only obligation, as I say, the British government had to ex-servicemen and women after 1922 was financing their disability pension. By 1926, 83,500 demobilised in Ireland, some 34,500 disabled veterans were in receipt of pensions from the Ministry of Pensions operating out of Merrion Square in Dublin. The majority of the veterans in the sample had no pension and no other source of income. Pensions were categorised between 20 and 100% and were not for life. 100% category was the loss of limbs, 20% was something like the loss of a finger. The majority of the claims I found in the research was 20%. There were many challenges in obtaining a pension. It was a complicated process of form filling and medical examinations. Many men were unaware of their pension entitlements, hence the work of the regimental associations. In the early days, there was a lack of pension administrative staff and office space. Pensions were the largest complaint identified in the Lavery report. Out of 268 pension cases examined by Lavery, 151 were inadequate or terminated pensions. An example of an inadequate pension was that of Mrs. Cleary from Tipperary. She lost her 3 sons killed in the war. Thomas, who served in the 1st Leinsters, Joseph in the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, and Patrick in the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment, killed during the March Offensive of 1918. She was in receipt of 8 shillings a week in 1928 in total as a pension for the loss of her 3 sons. Her husband was old and unable to work. She complained bitterly that with 8 shillings it was impossible to make ends meet. Captain J.F. Knox, ex-Royal Navy, of the Thurles branch of the Royal British Legion, championed her case to the Labour Commission in March 1928. They admitted she had grounds for complaint, but nothing happened. Common disabilities cited in my analysis were gunshot wounds, malaria, heart disease, lung damage from gas, and neuroasthenia. It's sort of a genetic word for men who have suffered mental breakdowns, or PTSD as we call it nowadays. Regarding the psychiatric pensions, in 1921, there was approximately 65,000 pensioners suffering from psychoneurotic afflictions in the United Kingdom. In Ireland, there was 12,420, with 500 of them in Irish asylums. Some were treated in Leopardstown Park Hospital. An example of one such psychiatric patient was Private Patrick Byrne, who again served in the Irish Guards. He wrote to the Lavery Committee in 1928, stating that in 1918 he was sent to a mental hospital and kept there for 12 months. Again, the Thurles branch of the British Legion made an appeal for a pension on Byrne's behalf. The committee noted in reply that, quote, "This man's case should be reconsidered as he is incapable of making any statement on his own, as he is completely mentally deficient," end quote. The Irish government attitude toward World War I veteran pensions was, like the British attitude to employment of ex-servicemen, not our problem. In March 1922, the British Ministry of Pensions proposed that the Irish Free State take over the running of war pensions. The British Exchequer would serve as the pension. However, the Irish rejected it. Again, in 1938, the British tried again to entice the Irish government to look after the pensions, this time with a budget of 1,435,000, and again, the Irish rejected it. The Irish government looked upon the help of British ex-service personnel as, quote, an imperial obligation, end quote. These men who fought for your cause were your problem, you look after them. In June 1936, the British Ministry of Pensions report noted, and I quote, "The Irish Free State refuses to regard itself as having participated as a nation in the Great War and has repudiated responsibility for the cost of its after effects. Every Southern Irishman who enlisted did so as a volunteer, and each individual must each bear responsibility for the results of his voluntary act or look to his employer, the British government, for redress. The Great War and its aftermath does not enter the ethical consciousness of the Irish Free State, with the result that those who suffered by volunteering their services excite neither interest nor sympathy." End quote. And that policy has been pretty much the same up to about 20 years ago. There are some British ex-service personnel help societies and sources of funding that operated in the Irish Free State and the Irish Republic after the end of World War I. These are just some of them I put up here. Some even to the present day. The societies, be they welfare or regimental associations, looked after the welfare of ex-servicemen and women and their families. They provided advice on the Irish social welfare system, out of work and health entitlements and insurances. Many of the men were unaware of these entitlements. As stated, they also helped to get pensions and jobs. To make sure that nobody fell through the administration cracks, these societies worked with each other in Dublin and in Britain, and men and women who applied for help. What I found, I'm just trying to say there, folks, is that what I found in studying these cards, that if a man or a woman applied for help and they would say he didn't qualify under, we'd say, for the Not Forgotten Society, they would send him over to the British Legion. If they couldn't help him, they'd send him on to the John Zammas. So in other words, the guy just didn't fall through the gaps. He was picked up by a long way. You can see the network of the ex-British sort of welfare societies working with each other to keep this person who's head above water. The number of British ex-service personnel, help societies, regimental associations and sources of charity funding I found in my analysis and in the report was 30. So you have these 30 of these networks. If you fell through it, somebody's going to pick you up. They also had the St. Vincent de Paul Society. So out of 6,805 cases in the study, 4,000 or 68% received grants. 32% received nothing. By 1920 alone, between 1920 and 1930, the Not Forgotten Society had paid out £15,220 to 832 applications. This was a minimum that had been paid out, and I don't know, it's probably worth about £1.5 million. And in 1928, the British Ministry of Pensions paid out £2 million to Irish ex-servicemen in the Irish Free State. So you can see where this money was coming from. I don't know what £2 million in 1928 is worth today, but I'm sure there's a lot of noughts at the end of it. I'd now like to turn to the assessment the society carried out and give offer some examples of the assistance given to these ex-servicemen and women. The assessment process began with a referral letter or a visit by the applicant to the society offices at 14 Merrion Square. The applicant had to honestly, and I underline the word honestly, fill out an application form for help. See this example on the screen here. The society would write to the local priest and check if the statements were accurate. If found to be lying, the applicant was barred from future applications. Occasionally, the local priest would assist the applications in completing the application forms. Father Tom Ryan in Whitefriars Street was a regular assistance to many of the ex-servicemen around the area. Essentially, the society wanted to know two things about the applicant. One, their financial affairs, their income from all sources and expenditure, and two, their personal and domestic well-beings and their state of health. In terms of the financial assessment, the society checked if the applicant had any source of income, such as a job, how much they earned, who was their employer, had they any unemployment benefits or any kind of insurance or pension. Had they any outstanding debts or hire purchases? Were they a member of any, quote, no clothing clubs, end quote, and had they, quote, no debts or pawnings, end quote. Help was categorised, and if an applicant's income exceeded the level for which help was allocated in this category, they were refused help. Grants varied in amounts. The money was seldom given to the applicants directly. Grants were paid directly, for example, to the local coal merchant, the local clothes shop, or bedding shop in the town. The duration of grants varied with the applications. For example, John Dennehy from a tenement in Sheriff Street in Dublin served in World War I and II in the Royal Army Service Corps. He got £3 towards his treatment of bronchitis for a year between 1946 and 1947. On the other hand, Christopher Cullen from Denmark Row served in the Royal Irish Regiment. He was discharged in 1917 with a 100% pension because of tuberculosis. He received £145 over 58 years between 1928 and 1926 when he died. In terms of the personal health and domestic being of the applicants, this indeed was very revealing when I went through the cards. The society would check if an applicant was genuinely ill. Their own doctor, they had a pool of doctors, would examine the applicant, and one chap, Dr. Cyril Watson from 43 Harrington Street, Dublin, was regularly used from the panel of doctors. They wanted to know if the applicants were capable of work and what was the probable duration of their illness. A caseworker would then follow the doctor's report and visit the particular man who asked for, or woman who asked for help. An example of one such report was that of John Dundon, who gave his address as St. Vincent's Hostel, Merchants Quay, Cork. He was a particularly tragic case of neglect and poverty. He served in the Dublin Fusiliers and was discharged on the 1st of March 1918 as a manic. He had a son in England and in an industrial school, and a daughter who was living with the nuns in a convent, who ended up in a mental hospital. The report noted, and I quote, "This man is a widower, aged 64 and a half years, and a bad neurotic. He lives at the above hostel and he pays 11 shillings and 3 pence per week for bed and light and breakfast. He has to buy his other meals outside. I am sure he rarely has a decent meal. When interviewed, this pensioner was wearing a suit given to him in April 1959. He had no overcoat, and I'm sure he feels the cold very much. A warm overcoat would be of great comfort to him. He also needs a warm pullover, underclothing, and if possible, 2 size 4 shirts with collars attached. This is a very neurotic man, and I'm sure he is not very popular to charitable organisations here. I believe he is blacklisted by Shannakill Hospital. Despite his manner, I do feel he should be helped, as no doubt all his failings are a result of his war service." End quote. Signed, Catherine Bracken, 11th of February 1960. Sometimes the report would not be so kind to the applicant. For example, Joseph Quinn from Dunlish, County Longford, served in the first Dublins in Gallipoli. In April 1949, he applied for financial assistance. He'd been out of work suffering from rheumatism. Based on a report by Father John Meehan, the local parish priest, dated the 2nd of February 1954, the society wrote to Quinn declining his help, noting, quote, "Your distress appears to be more due to unemployment than incapacity for work resulting from war disablement." End quote. Sorry, that's that one there. Yeah. So Finally, each applicant had their own personal reason for requesting help over the years. In analysing the 6,805 veterans, I broke down the request of help into 5 main categories of assistance arranged in order of frequency, namely widows, clothing, medical, fuel, and unusual. One of the earliest applicants to the society was from Daniel Brady of number 20, Abbeyfield, Calester, as the man you mentioned, in Dublin. He served in the London Regiment, had no pension, but was given £60 help between 1919 and 1928. One of the last claims ever made on that they researched was from Cecil Baker from Ulverton, Dalkey, County Dublin. He served in D Company of the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, a member of the PALs. He had a gunshot wound to the left leg, which required amputation. His family received £25 for funeral expenses when he died on the 21st of October 1992. The following are some examples from the categories. I won't keep it, we're nearly there, folks, that I discovered. In terms of widows, they had the highest number of, the highest frequency of applications for help that I discovered so far, mainly widows. The widow was Sergeant William Barry of the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment from Lord Edward Street in Kilkenny. Sergeant Barry was killed on the 9th of October 1914, aged 34. His widow received £2 in May 1926, and she soon died after it. An application for help came from her daughter to carry on the help in 1944, and she was refused point blank. On clothing, Robert Dixon, who served in the Royal Field Artillery, in March 1921, he received assistance of 5 shillings a week for 4 weeks for baby clothing. On medical, the majority of the medical applications I discovered were for dental treatment, I should say. However, John Barr from Mitchelstown in County Cork served in the Labour Corps. He received 8 shillings and 6pence a week in up to 1932. He died in November 1935. George Dixon from Crumlin in Dublin served in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He suffered with a heart condition for most of his life. He received £29 in 1954. Sadly, this poor man died of pneumonia and malnutrition in a Dublin hospital in 1962. He was 76 years of age alone. In terms of fuel, I already mentioned Edward Butford from Dundalk, who served in the Royal Field Artillery. He received regular loads of coal from Elphinstone coal merchants in Dundalk, and the society paid out the coal merchants straightforward up to the mid-1960s. And finally, some unusual applications. Nicholas Bulger from Cuffs Grange, County Kilkenny, served in the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers. He was killed in action in 1916, though, facing Whitesheet, familiar name. His mother, Bridget, was given seed potatoes in 1927 as some kind of compensation. Another Irish Guardsman, Edward Dalton from Ballyconnell, County Cavan, had a gunshot wound to the right arm up to 1950. And up to 1950, he was given £60 help, which included a grant for the purchase of a donkey and cart. So, some conclusions. In November 1927, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Irish Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, Mr. M. Heffernan, referred to the Irish ex-servicemen and women of World War I as being, quote, nobody's children. He was right. And like all abandoned children, the fittest survived and got on with their lives the best they could, and the weakest failed. The failures of the weakest attributed to or aggravated by their war services was, as I have shown, particularly tragic to them. However, there were many nets to catch the fallen ex-service man or woman. Unlike my father or mother, who were born into tenement Dublin in 1915, they and the thousands like them had no such luxury and relied simply on the St. Vincent de Paul if we fell on hard times. Like their ex-service neighbours, they too struggled to find work and survive to live in the 1930s and 1940s Dublin. The man you see standing in this photograph with his head on the headstone is Mr. Kevin Cunningham. He is standing by the grave of his late father, Sergeant Tommy Cunningham of the 2nd Royal Dublin Fusiliers in Mount Jerome Cemetery, who died in 1964. I just want to give a plug, folks, to the flag. There's a group of people in the audience here tonight who have done Trojan work in logging up and recording and presenting the men who served the Dublin Fusiliers who had died buried in Mount Jerome Cemetery. And it's a wonderful project, pure history research. So well done, guys, on that. I once asked Kevin, did his father ever talk to him about his time in the Great War? And to quote Kevin, he said, "I did, Tom," replied Kevin, "little and often, but he was too concerned about rearing his family than he was about what happened in the past," end quote. And that, my dear friends, is just about sums it up for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. I have lots of questions to ask you about all of that. And I want to just say thank you to Tom for organising this event. I've really enjoyed all the papers, and it's been really, really fascinating. And I first met Tom in, I think, 2012 at a conference in Kilmainham. And he's been a wonderful support to me with my research ever since. I was a very young, naive PhD student at the time, starting out with little idea of the world I was entering into. I'd also like to thank the National Library for all their work in organising today. I spent a very happy year in the National Library Manuscripts Department in 2016, 2017, and 2015, 2016, I think. And it's somewhere that I always like to return. So what I'm talking about is very much focused on the women's experiences in the aftermath of the war, which is something that I've been working on for the past 11 or so years, and have recently, in 2020, published a book on Irish women in the Great War. Today I'm going to start with the armistice to bring us back a little bit in time, and then looking forward into what happened to people in the years afterwards. In her memoir, Catherine Tynan described the armistice on 11th November 1918 as the amazing, the incredible thing, so long prayed for and hoped for, that when the promise of it came, no one quite believed it. But the ending of the war brought ambivalent feelings for many women. The historian Jay Winter has suggested that exhaustion was the prevailing feeling. The cost of the war had been too great to allow for jubilation. Too many wounds, too many losses. Similar sentiments were evident among the Irish women who were bereaved by the war. Over 35,000 Irish men lost their lives in the First World War, and they left many devastated families behind in Ireland, and they struggled with conflicting emotions raised by the armistice. Rosamund Stephen described a visit to her neighbour in Belfast to tell her the news of the armistice. She sat by the fire saying, "I'm glad, I'm very glad," and really she did not care two straws because her Oni was killed in action and Joe was in a lunatic asylum with shell shock. She was very fond of those two boys. Veronica Wynne from County Wicklow wrote to her mother in November 1918, stating that while the announcement of the armistice was frightfully thrilling, one cannot help wanting her own boy badly. She was referring to her brother Charles, who died of wounds while serving in France in June 1917. The end of the war did bring enormous relief to the women who were anxiously awaiting the return of their loved ones, but a sense of deflation and uncertainty was a common response, especially among those who had been active in the war effort. Elizabeth Burke Plunkett, the Countess of Fingal, recalled in her memoir her subdued reaction, saying, "I used to think and say during the war that if ever that list of dead and wounded would cease, I would never mind anything or grumble at anything again. But when the armistice came at last, we seemed drained of all feeling, and one felt nothing." A Catholic and a liberal unionist, Burke Plunkett had been very active in the war effort. She was particularly involved in supporting Irish prisoners of war through the Irish Women's Association, and involved in various other initiatives in Ireland. She was a member of the landed gentry, a class which had suffered disproportionately during the war. Letitia Overend of the Airfield Estate in Dundrum, County Dublin, described in her diary her sense of anxiety and uncertainty after 11th November, saying, "For afterwards it's well to note that these days of the first relaxing of the chain of war after 4 years are odd, and no one can quite realise what has happened. We work as usual, but the pace of change and not knowing what may happen next is very hard to grasp." And it's worth noting here that I went through Letitia's diaries for the whole war period, and they're pocket diaries where she notes down meetings and where she needs to be, and she rarely at all makes any sort of personal comment on what she's experiencing. And so this brief mentions that she puts in here after the armistice are even more notable, I think, because of that. You really get very little sense of celebration in her diary at this time. She notes the last day of work at the Irish War Hospital supply depot at Merrion Square as being very sad. Her life during the war was filled with a sense of purpose and active engagement in her work with the St. John Ambulance Association and her very heavy involvement with the Irish War Hospital supply depot. She was commandant of the Alexandra College Nursing Division, and she was someone of importance in that role. She was admired, depended on by others, and her presence at meetings was needed. She may have been concerned that she would lose all of this when the war ended, and their life might seem empty without it. Her daily schedule does quiet down from spring 1919, although she does remain involved with St. John Ambulance Association. Many war workers who served overseas found it difficult to adjust to civilian life, and we're familiar with this trope from looking at ex-soldiers, but it's also true to some extent for the women. Sophie Pearce-Evans from County Limerick had been studying at the Royal College of Science when the war broke out, already something quite unusual for a woman of her era, and she abandoned her studies in 1917 to join the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. She just got married in 1916 to a British soldier. And by joining the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, it allowed her to earn her own income, to exchange domestic responsibilities for a more adventurous life. She served in England, first as a messenger, where she wrote something for the Royal College of Science magazine about how she was having no end of a rag and getting up at dances with the soldiers and having lots of fun. She later served in France with an ambulance unit, and the portrait over here is painted by Sir John Lavery while she was in France in 1919. She returned to the Royal College of Science in 1919 on her demobilisation, although her husband wanted her to move with him to Africa. She did eventually join her husband, but she was unable or unwilling to settle down into married life in a traditional domestic role, and the marriage did not last. And it was the first of a few that didn't. She became a keen athlete and was one of the founders of the Women's Amateur Athletic Association. And in 1926, she qualified as a private pilot, becoming the first woman in Ireland or Great Britain to obtain a commercial flying licence, and touring the USA, demonstrating her aviation skills. And so we can see a photo of her in this more exciting period of her life. Her experience with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps gave her the opportunity to escape her family life. She had a particularly tragic background as a young child. Her father had murdered her mother. And the expectations placed on her by society to fulfill a fairly traditional domestic role. She craves the adventure and the danger offered by the war, and our biographer suggested that she spent the rest of her life trying to recover those lost days of excitement and independence. And as you can see, she achieved great success in her life, but also struggled on a personal level and died in rather sad circumstances. Veronica Wynne, who lost her brother Charles, was initially concerned about what the ending of the war meant for her. She'd been employed in the Census office in London, and when the armistice came, she wasn't sure about what this would mean for her if she would need to return home. Her letters to her mother displayed the uncertainty created by the armistice, saying, "Mrs. Phil seems to think we might get a week's notice any time soon. I don't think anyone really knows." A couple of days later, she writes again, saying she wished she had some idea what is likely to happen and when one might have a definite time to look forward to. Initially reluctant to come home, she quickly becomes enthused about the prospect, saying that the work is stale and stifling. "I'm longing to paint and to write, and still more to be home. It is long enough to be away when the war was on." And this is a sense, that in wartime, even maybe perhaps a little bit dull, mundane work in an office held a higher sense of purpose. You were part of something bigger than yourself. And then once it's over, you want to just get back to your own, your home and your life beforehand. She feels a sense of uncertainty and instability about her job, and this is very common at the time, with the armistice having a very immediate economic impact. Veronica came from an upper class family. Her family were involved in the Avoca hand weavers, and she had independent means. Many working class women face the same uncertainty and instability, but they also face unemployment and hardship in Ireland and Great Britain with the war ending. Those who worked in munitions or employed on War Office contracts very quickly found themselves without work and with little prospect of new employment except in domestic service. The photograph here is from the Dublin Shell factory at Park 8 Street near Euston Station, where hundreds of women were employed in munitions work during the war. Between the armistice and the end of April 1920, the number of women employed in either army work or industrial work in the United Kingdom decreased by over 600,000. The termination of army contracts, the anticipated return of enlisted men, meant the immediate loss of employment for women. There was an 8.3% contraction in the number of women employed in industry in Ireland between November 1918 and July 1919. So quite dramatically, the situation is changing for women's employment. Need it in wartime. Thanks very much. Off you go. Go home. Many workers in munitions factory were laid off within a few weeks of the announcement of the armistice. Unemployment, as we've heard, was high in post-war Ireland. Men were given priority for what work was available, and so there was little opportunities for women. Among those seeking employment were former members of the Women's Services. So these are the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Royal Air Force, and the Women's Royal Naval Service, and various other organisations that had become amalgamated into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Hundreds of Irish women served with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. We don't have precise numbers, which is largely due to the fact that in World War II, the personnel records for this organisation from the First World War were destroyed in the London Blitz. So I've located hundreds of women in their records who enlisted from Ireland, but what survives in Kew, the National Archives, is only 12.5% of what was anticipated, the full total records, and there's no way of knowing how many Irish people were among those. There were well over 100 women who served from Ireland with the Royal Naval Service as well, And people joined these organisations in 1917 and 1918. They're set up to provide support services for the British Army with the idea that they would release more men from military service. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps arose out of the Women's Voluntary Reserve and the Women's Legion, which had both been established much earlier in the war by a woman with strong Ulster connections, Edith, 7th Marchioness of Londonderry. These organisations were paid work, so a bit different to doing voluntary work for the Red Cross, for example, during the war, or the many other voluntary activities that women could and did become involved in. So they're an attractive alternative to domestic service or work in textile factories for Irish working class women. And so my examination of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, looking at the Irish members, suggests that a fairly typical Irish member was single, in her early 20s, and from a working class background. So a bit more diverse profile than, I say, from the Red Cross at the time. They served at various sites in Ireland as well as overseas in Britain and in France, and in a mix of different types of jobs, in clerical work, cooks, waitresses, and so forth. The Irish members of the RANS, the Royal Naval Service, were primarily local women from port areas who previously worked in the dockyards. So in Queenstown, now known as Cove, the recruits were usually almost all local women, and this was actually a necessity because there wasn't suitable accommodation provided for the RANS there, so most of them came from the area or travelled daily from Cork City. There was a little bit of concern from the War Office about setting up these subdivisions in areas such as Queenstown, with concern about the security implications, concern that Queenstown might be a difficult place for a depot because of the high numbers of British and American naval men, and the sort of political challenges in the area. There was concern also about what they called a religious question, the fact that most of the recruits were Catholic, and again whether this would maybe perhaps raise any security issues. All women from Ireland who were recruited for the RANS were subjected to additional security scrutiny by the intelligence department, regardless of the type of work that they were involved in. So it was much more widespread type of intelligence scrutiny compared to that given to British women. So there was a lot of comments about how the women could be trusted and were doing excellent work, the high quality of recruits from Ireland, but there was a little bit of wariness on the side of the organisations about the women that they were recruiting. It is important to note that the women were recruited on the same terms as the British women, with the same expectations and conditions of service. However, they did not receive the same treatment when the war ended. By May 1920, over 100,000 British and Irish women had been demobilised. Those working in trades dependent on government contracts or on Women's Service Corps were entitled to what was known as the out-of-work donation, which came from the British government. It was very important for Irish women. By February 1919, over 33,000 women and girls were in receipt of this payment, making up 35% of all Irish recipients. But the British government decided in February 1919 that they would limit the availability of the out-of-work donation to people who fulfilled certain criteria. So they're limiting to demobilised servicemen, insured trades, or certain trades certified by the Lord Lieutenant, as where a substantial amount of unemployment had been caused by the hostilities. While in Britain at the same time, they could receive the out-of-work donation of 15 shillings a week without having to prove specific difficulties contributing to their unemployment. So there were different entitlements, different benefits for Irish women compared to British women, despite having served in the same organisations. This wasn't just accepted by people in Ireland. It was argued at the time that it was unjust to afford preferential treatment to women enrolled in Great Britain. They'd been enrolled on equal terms, but were not getting the same treatment afterwards. And it was raised constantly over the next couple of years, but the Ministry of Labour insisted that little could be done to change the situation unless they could prove that there was a general boycott against war workers in Ireland. And it's worth noting that the women did receive support from the Irish Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers, so the men were also paying attention to this unequal treatment. An Irish member of the Women's Royal Air Force complained in the Irish Citizen, the Irish suffrage newspaper, in October 1919 that she and her fellow Irish members had been let go with just a week's notice and a week's pay. And the editor of the newspaper described it as a scandalous shame to throw so many women out of employment and to make no provision for them, and used it to argue for their belief in the need for Irish independence, saying so long as Ireland is ruled by a foreign country, her resources will always be used by that country for her own benefit, while every useful purpose in Ireland will be starved. And it does seem, these were women who'd voluntarily enrolled in these organisations, had done their bit for the war effort. Whether they enrolled primarily for economic or patriotic or personal reasons, in a sense, doesn't matter. They had, fulfilled their war service and then were being given discriminatory treatment afterwards, leading to resentments and difficulties. They were liable to lose their donation if they refused any work offered through the labour exchanges. And so many women lost their donation even before they received the very first payment because they hesitated over the first job that might have been offered by the labour exchange. And so women were being refused benefit for no good reason in Ireland, even so former munitions workers who'd got the payment due to their work being contingent on the work conditions. If they were offered a menial role in domestic service immediately afterwards and they wanted to hold out for something that they felt was more suitable to their skills, they immediately lost all unemployment benefit because they were seen as having turned down a viable job. They were reluctant to enter domestic service, especially those who'd worked in munitions work, because they've been used to the higher pay, but also the greater freedoms offered by war work. And so in the 1920s, there was what was described as a servant problem for the middle and upper classes in Ireland, with the domestic service sector, which had already been in decline in 1914, but becoming in a more serious situation in the 1920s. And this is blamed on the fact that munitions workers had enjoyed wartime freedoms, which created a new conception of the rights and the liberties which they should be entitled to. The Irish Citizen again praised the women who refused domestic service work, seeing it as a healthy and a significant sign of the times and an indication of the spread of the feminist spirit. However, one might prefer a more remunerative or an exciting job, but there are limited opportunities available. And many of the demobilised workers had no choice but to eventually accept domestic service or to emigrate from Ireland. Many workers who participated in paid work were eligible to apply to the Central Committee for Women's Training and Employment for the State of Ireland, which is the British government scheme, which operated from 1920 to 1922. And it provided funds for training for women who had suffered financially due to the war. So women who had served in a wartime occupation and had then were struggling to find work afterwards, or also the family members of soldiers who had fallen on hard times as a result of the men's war service. They're a really rich source. There's much more limited information in them compared to the sort of files that Tom was talking about, but they give you some sense of the sort of issues that could cause lasting financial legacies for families, and also the sorts of training that was considered suitable for women at the time. There's lots of examples in them of former WAC members, and some of these are people seeking from upper middle class families who are seeking funds to support their university education, while others are seeking support with nursing or midwifery training. There were comments on the suitability of the sort of course that people were pursuing, how it related to their social class, but also what the board considered to be their ability. So women had more success if they applied for more traditional domestic sort of training. And there were various training courses. Tom mentioned training courses for ex-servicemen, and there were training courses for ex-service women as well, but these focused on domestic roles. And so this is very much a global effort at the time to restore traditional order, to restore traditional gender relations, and to push women back into the home. Many wealthy grants did give women an opportunity to improve their circumstances and to take responsibility for their education and welfare. Many women cannot wait for the schemes to become available or were not successful with their applications, and they had no choice but to emigrate to seek work. And this re-established the pre-war pattern of exceptionally high immigration from Ireland. So during the war, immigration basically stopped, but as soon as it ended, the numbers started going up again, and there were very high numbers of women leaving. The British government supported this through various schemes aimed at sending people to the colonies. The Overseas Settlement Office offered free passage to the colonies for ex-service women who'd completed 6 months service. They wanted to try and address the gender imbalance in post-war society caused by the unprecedented loss of men, and also to send women to areas where there were fewer British women. And so various Irish women took advantage of these schemes. Well, the Irish Citizen, of course, warned Irish women against participation in it, seeing it as exploitative. Others felt they had no choice. During the War of Independence and the Civil War, British military veterans and others considered loyal to the British government. Some of them were subjected to violence and to intimidation. And as has been mentioned, there were limited employment opportunities for ex-servicemen and women. I think it's worth reflecting here a little bit on, the importance of intimidation and perception. So there's a lot of debate about the precise number of ex-servicemen who were killed by the IRA or who were attacked by the IRA. And in one sense, that isn't what matters so much as did people feel that they might be attacked? Did they feel fear in their local community? Were they subjected to low-level intimidation? Did they feel unwelcome? And the evidence from many archives suggests there is at least that perception in many local communities, which impacted on their actions. And as Thomas mentioned, many veterans depended on the British Legion and the Southern Irish Loyalist Association for basic support. Records of these organisations revealed the desperate circumstances that many families found themselves in after the war ended. And these are just a couple of examples from the Southern Irish Loyalist Association, which are printed in their pamphlets in 1925. One describing himself married ex-serviceman with a wife, 10 children, and they were naked and they wanted some clothing at the present time. I served 3 years in the late war. I'm in a very bad way at this present time for clothing. My wife is about to become a mother again, and I don't know what to do. The daughter of a recently deceased veteran wrote to the same organisation, saying she and her siblings were struggling to survive on the wage of her brother, who'd only earned a few shillings a week. And she pleaded that employment is very scarce here, and it's not ex-servicemen or their sons that gets what employment there is. And again, others might disagree with this and say that there were some businesses that offered preferential employment to ex-servicemen, but there were other areas where this was not the case and where people felt that the struggles were due to their war service. Associating with organisations such as the Southern Irish Loyalist Association or the British Legion exposed the veterans and their families to accusations of disloyalty and then to potential intimidation and violence. And so they have to, in order to get financial support, these are the organisations that are there, that are available to them and are offering support. But by doing so, they're identifying themselves as ex-servicemen, and in some ways, as you know, certainly with the Southern Irish Loyalist Association, as loyalists, and so placing a political emphasis on what they're doing. The British Legion reported in 1927 on the pitiful conditions in Ireland and noted that in many areas the men are afraid to identify themselves with the Legion because to acknowledge themselves as British ex-servicemen would mean unemployment and no guardian's relief. Applications for compensation and support to the Irish Grants Distress Committee also reveals many examples of soldiers' families being targeted by the IRA during the War of Independence and the Civil War. In August 1922, for example, Deborah Ball from County Offaly was tied to a gate outside her home for 3 hours following a raid on her house. She was a loyalist and she participated in war relief work in the Great War. Many of these families fled Ireland, including Deborah Ball, feeling that they were no longer welcome in their home communities or indeed in their organisations, or indeed in their own country. Although historians have focused more on the experience of ex-soldiers, some former members of the women's services also faced hostility on their return to civilian life in Ireland or found it difficult to adjust to the changed political climate. One Irish WAAC member sold her farm in Kildare after the war and she moved to Australia, allegedly because she was unable to cope with the prevailing disloyalty. The loss of her 2 brothers and a fiancé in the war also likely affected her return home and perhaps made it emotionally difficult to stay in Ireland. The case of another Irish WAAC member illustrates the prejudice encountered by some of these women on their return. Annie Kelly was sexually assaulted when on leave from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in Dublin in 1919. Her assailant justified his actions with the belief that she had a bad character, as he believes that no decent Irish girl would be in the army. When the case came to court, the defendant's solicitor allegedly attempted to cast doubt on Annie Kelly's testimony by pointing out that she was only a WAAC and consequently that her word could not be relied upon. She sought help from what was now known as the Queen Mary Army Auxiliary Corps as to obtain protection from those people whose wrath I've incurred by serving my king and country. While such incidents of sexual violence and erroneous assumptions about the morality of WAAC members were not unique to Ireland, Annie Kelly's case had particular political connotations. She evidently believed that her war service had caused hostility towards her by those opposed to her ideals of king and country. The violence and intimidation experienced by military veterans in post-war Ireland is believed to be a factor in the much higher rate of shell shock among soldiers in Ireland than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. The War Office discontinued the pensions of Irish soldiers who were consigned to what were then called lunatic asylums, which placed further hardship on their families. For example, Florence O'Brien, aged 19, applied to the Cork Board, the Central Committee for Women's Training and Employment, for a grant in April 1922 to assist with her nursing training. 2 of her brothers had served in the army during the war, one was killed and the other was confined to an asylum afterwards. The loss of both their earnings meant that there were not enough funds to support her and her younger sister, and so they both required funds from the Central Committee for training. Women were also physically or mentally affected by the war service, experience of bombardment close to the front lines, infections contracted overseas, the mental and physical legacies of years of overwork and traumatic conditions in hospitals. These all left their toll on Irish women, and some succumbed to their illnesses. Edith Crine was one of 12 Irish women who passed away in 1919 while on active service. She died in Dublin in March 1919 from typhoid, contracted serving with the French Red Cross. Isa Mahoney is believed to have contracted tuberculosis while nursing soldiers in France. She passed away at home in Dublin in April 1919 after 19 months of poor health. Her father ensured that her name was included along with her brother Edmund's on the parish memorial in St Mary's Church, which you can see here on Haddington Road. And you can't, the photograph isn't very clear, but you can see there's one name that's added, but after a bit of a gap towards the bottom of them there, and that's Isa Mahoney's name. Venice Hackett caught influenza while nursing with the Red Cross in France in October 1919. She was sent home but died in London on her way home to County Offaly. Her parents had already suffered the loss of 2 sons on active service, as well as the younger son who died at home in 1915. Venice Elise could be brought home for burial in the local graveyard in Ballycumber. And you can see that's her grave there, marking her as a Great War veteran. And in the graveyard you can see the list of all of the children from the family who died in the war. Other women veterans suffered lasting health problems. Rosalind Cadiz, a former militant suffragette who joined the war effort in 1914 despite having served in prison the previous year for suffrage protests, suffered a lasting back injury while nursing soldiers in Dublin with the Red Cross and never fully recovered. Women were entitled to apply for disability pensions if the injury could be confirmed as related to their war service. And there are some Irish women among the records for disability pensions in the archives in London. These include women who developed bronchitis while on war service abroad and were left with lasting health issues. Another one who contracted malaria while serving in East Africa with the Queen Alexandra Imperial Military Nursing Service. Many more women struggled with the burden of being thrust into the role of caregivers or breadwinners for their husbands who'd been mentally or physically incapacitated by the war. The veterans suffering from shell shock or neurasthenia were often treated far from home, which placed a further strain on marriages which had been already in difficulty due to the wartime separation. The trauma endured by the men, together with their frustration at their incapacity at home, often resulted in volatile behaviour and sometimes violent outbursts. And even without the strain of disability, couples who reunited after the war's end often struggled to become accustomed to each other after years of absence. The men returned to a domestic world that had functioned in their absence, and to wives who perhaps resented having to submit once more to patriarchal authority. The high post-war unemployment further affected the attempts to re-establish pre-war family dynamics. Catherine Switzer has evoked the experience of Belfast veterans in the years following demobilisation. They now had no work and often no decent clothes to wear. They recalled horrible experiences. They seemed never to have left the war. The Story murder in 1917 offered a grim foreboding of the challenges facing families after demobilisation. Robert Story came home to Dublin on leave from the Royal Dublin Fusiliers in January 1917. Hours before he was due to return, he stabbed his wife and himself in front of their 6-year-old child. The coroner concluded that the soldier's actions were caused by a fit of insanity. Jane Leonard's work portrays the lasting trauma experienced by demobilised Irish veterans and suggests that domestic harmony following demobilisation was all too often disrupted by violence, marital breakdown or suicide. Divorce rates rose in the post-war world in many combatant countries, which the historian Jay Winter has attributed to the impact of the long separation on marriages and the failure of the hurried marriages in autumn 1914 to survive the post-war reunion. Divorce was not available in the Irish Free State and only through the parliamentary system in Northern Ireland, which makes this history more difficult to track for Ireland. But there were nonetheless other means of coping with marital breakdown, with divorce Irish style, referring to migration with the intent of desertion or agreed separation. Family abandonment was not uncommon. Michael Brophy, an ex-soldier, was convicted of the willful neglect of his wife and young children in 1922, while Daniel Hogan's wife was obliged to write to the War Office in 1926 to seek his whereabouts, only to be told that he had died 5 years previously. He'd been discharged as medically unfit in 1917 and had lost contact with his family in the intervening years. Paul Smith's novel, The Countrywoman, evokes the experience of his mother, inspired by the childhood experience of his mother, evokes the difficulty endured by some working class women on the return of their husbands. Mrs. Baines, the novel's central character, had enjoyed a wartime improvement in the standard of living of her family due to the separation allowance, but she dreaded her husband's return. Pat Wood, she knew, eventually returned from France and the Dardanelles, and she knew around the lane and behind her back, women said, with medals and ribbons, a pension and his old thirst for Irish whiskey. The precarious living situation of his family was quickly destroyed on his arrival home. He abused his wife and neglected his children, spending his pension on alcohol. His wife dies in the workhouse after an assault and is buried in unmarked Papa's grave. The author does not attribute Baines' behaviour to the trauma he experienced in the war, but blames it on the opportunities for drinking provided by the army disability pensions. A neighbour of the family remarks on his abusive behaviour and his drunkenness, commenting, "You think the war would have changed him?" Her companion retorts that the war gives him an excuse for the greater thirst he came back with, and puts him in the way of getting money to quench it from the British Legion and all the other patriotic bodies in the city. He's not seen as unique within the context of the novel. Another character, Mr. Trail, who's reported as coming home from the war, begins wearing a carnation in his buttonhole and on Saturday setting fire to his wife. Margaret Barrington raises the question of the brutalising effects of the war in her semi-autobiographical novel, My Cousin Justin. And in it she asks, why had he changed from that gentle, sensitive boy? The war, perhaps, but had he changed? Had he not always this bitter enmity towards his fellows, this desire to hurt them? She felt that her husband's war service had created a division between them that could not be bridged. As I watched my husband and my cousin, I realised for the first time that though they had their limbs intact, each was as badly mutilated as if he'd lost an arm or a leg. What they'd lost was more, because one cannot see it. The scars of war lay on their souls, and old wounds ache. The servicemen would talk of their war while drinking together, but the women could not be part of this shared remembrance and this companionship. She wrote, I was troubled and unhappy, not because Egan was drinking, but because there was some link between him and my cousin, which I cannot understand and which I hated. The relationship between the narrator and the character Egan is believed to be based on Barrington's troubled marriage to the writer and Great War veteran Liam O'Flaherty. O'Flaherty served in the British Army from 1915 until 1917, and he was invalided out, suffering from shell shock. Just as the men were haunted by their experiences in the trenches, many women had to learn to cope with absences and reminders of all they'd lost. Young war widows became a depressingly familiar sight in Ireland in the days of the war and its aftermath. With Catherine Tynan describing how one would see them and get to know the look of the new widows, hard, bright eyes burning for the relief of tears, a feverish flush in the cheeks, hands that trembled, and occasional uncertain movement of the young head. And some of these included women who would have married but lost her sweetheart during the war. Phyllis Kelly, a young woman at Lone, was engaged with an English soldier, Eric Appleby, who she met at a dance in Ireland in 1914. They exchanged regular correspondence during his service in France and became engaged, but she received word in October 1916 that he was dangerously wounded. And in an unsent letter, she describes her devastation at the news and saying that it will be the end of everything that matters because, O Englishman, you're all the world and life to me. Just 3 days later, received word that he had died in October 1916. She never married, and she kept an image of Eric over her bed for the rest of her life. Some women cannot cope with their wartime losses. Private Thomas Joyce was killed by a shell at the front in late 1915. On 2nd of January 1916, his widow Mary Ellen Joyce drowned herself in a pond in County Leitrim. She left a note for her mother saying, "She'd gone to Tommy. We promised one another we would follow each other." This is not an isolated case. Rosamond Stephen described 2 suicides in her Belfast neighbourhood involving the mothers of soldiers, which were attributed to the women's anxiety over their sons in the trenches. War widows received pensions from the British government, but these were conditional on good behaviour, and they were ended if the women remarried or in other ways were considered unworthy of the pension. They're based on a middle class expectation of a sober, discreet, grieving widow who would care for the children of a fallen hero. We can get many sense from the individual stories of the financial impact of losses on families left behind and on the financial struggles that many people had surviving on these widows' pensions and on the more limited support for mothers and siblings of people who were killed. And one example of this is actually in Tom Burke's work from Messine to Carrickhill, where he refers to the financial impact of the loss of Michael Wall on his mother Therese and on his younger siblings. And you get a real sense, the desperate grief that they're experiencing, but also the material impact and what it means for the family. And there are many other examples just like this. In her novel The Last September, published in 1929, Elizabeth Bowen depicted the sense of decline among the landed gentry and the stifling legacy of the war for the novel's young female protagonist. She wrote, Mrs. Fogarty's drawing room was drawn with photographs. All the dear boys who for years back have been garrisoned at Clonmore, many of whom, alas, have been killed in that dreadful war. You cannot stop to put a cup on one of the little tables without a twinge of regret and embarrassment, meeting the candid eyes of some dead young man. The sense of the dead being ever present is expressed in the memoir of the Countess of Fingal. She described her difficulty in coping with the losses her social circle had sustained. The world we had known had vanished. We hunted again, but ghosts rode at us. We sat at table, but there were absent faces. The end of the war in 1918 resulted in further turmoil for many Irish women. The contraction in employment opportunities following the armistice had particularly severe consequences in Ireland, with their high unemployment, but also women were more limited in their eligibility for unemployment benefit. Women sought alternatives, domestic service where possible, but also to try to build on their wartime experiences. The rebuilding of domestic life and the difficulties faced by the wives of Irish soldiers who returned with severe physical or mental disabilities needs further examination. We get some sense from the novels The Countrywoman and my Cousin Justin, which hint at some of the difficulties experienced by the families of demobilised soldiers. In my book, I pieced together the stories of many Irish women whose lives were affected by the war. These included Isabella Clarke, who left her home in Belfast at age 16 to work in munitions factories in England, to Marie Martin and Isa Mahoney, served in voluntary nursing roles with the Red Cross in France and Malta, and Letitia Overend, who played an important leadership role with the Wartime St. John Ambulance Association. I've attempted also to find the voices of those who remained at home, the mothers, wives and sisters of soldiers. Emily Shirley, who busied herself with charitable work in Monaghan while waiting for her son to return home, but who herself passed away in 1918 before the war ended. Santa MacDonald, who kept the family farm going in her husband's absence, and wrote to tell him about the new puppy and how proud he would be of their young children, only for the letter to be returned to her husband's possessions when he died only a few months before the war ended. Mary Martin, who kept a diary for 6 months in 1916, so that her son Charlie, reported missing at Gallipoli, might be brought up to date on all that he missed, a diary which ends abruptly when she receives official confirmation that he'd indeed died the previous December. And Phyllis Kelly with a picture of her lost sweetheart above her bed for the rest of her life. My interest in this area began with just one woman and one document. Isabel Meredith, a young Dublin woman who received an award from the St. John Ambulance Association for her service and courage in helping civilians during the Easter Rising. Isabel was my great-grandmother, and I found this item among the family papers from my grandparents' house when I was doing my undergrad. I knew her brother had served with the wartime British Army, but I knew nothing of her own wartime role. Her having received this honour from the Easter Rising was of interest to me because I knew nothing about what she might have been involved in then, and so wanted to know more about how she ended up being involved in the St. John Ambulance Association. My desire to learn more about it led me on a journey which culminated in eventually writing the book and in the research that I do now. This is a picture of her here in the early 1920s, holding her son, who grew up to be my grandfather, Anthony Meldon, who later himself served in World War II with the British Navy, but who sadly lost his mother while on active service overseas. He sadly passed away before I could ask him to tell me more about Isabel and her war, so I've been trying to fill in the gaps myself in the intervening years. Immersing myself in the diaries, letters and memoirs of women such as these has been a moving experience, and I've attempted to recover the voices of these women, and by doing so to shed light on aspects of our history that have been all too often ignored or forgotten. Thank you.
I was wondering, before the regiments were expanded, did the men in the regiments, did they kind of know it was going to come, or was it a surprise, or were they prepared?
I think the writing was on the wall for quite some time, and I think once the treaty had been publicised in December of 1921, it would be very clear that there wasn't a future for those regiments, and then it was a question of what was going to happen to them. Those regiments had always been recruited in Ireland. It was pretty clear that situation wasn't going to continue. And so I think they would have known, okay? Even before the formal disbandment is announced in March of 22, you're beginning to see officers and senior NCOs transferring out. Okay, so they had already, they knew it was coming, I think, yeah.
Is there much bitterness?
Um,
They just accepted as an action.
I don't know, Pat, what do you think?
I think the fact that they had the opportunity to transfer, you know, those who wanted to continue a career in the British Army. But as the point I made that for once political, financial and military requirements coincided, and it's a lovely soft way out for the British Army to meet its reduction targets by expanding the Irish regiments. Now, one little thing that came up during the treaty negotiations, and you always have to be careful about what's asked for or what's given in negotiations, but at one stage in the subcommittee on defence, the British put forward a proposal that recruitment for the British Army could continue openly in the Free State, in the new Free State, if it was settled. And, you know, it would be, and the hint was that they could maintain the Irish regiments. But that was shot down by the Irish side. And there's an interesting little note on the thing that somebody made the point that competitive recruiting will only benefit the soldiers. You couldn't possibly have that on that. So I think kind of it, as Arthur said, they've been aware of it, but they had their options, you know, and that was it, you know.
I was wondering during the talk by Emmanuel earlier, and he's not here, but about when there was talk about the transition from the on the military side. How about the transition with regard to administrative matters? Did the existing civil service work smoothly with the new Irish government?
Yeah. So from what I'm aware of, you know, I think when the treaty was signed at the start of 1920, agreed at the end of 1921 and ratified in January 22, there was a merger of what was the the Doyle Civil Service and the existing British Civil Service in Ireland. And some 200 people came from the Doyle Civil Service to, 25,000 people who were in British Civil Service in Ireland. You know, that would be anything from administrators to teachers, whatever, you know, different. And so, yes, you had a fairly smooth transfer. And it's something that had been thought of by the Irish Civil Service going back to the Home Rule crisis of 1913, 1914. And they saw that something like this was coming. And they had organised and they had made arrangements and lobbied internally that if Home Rule, in whatever form, comes, that they would, you know, what would happen to the civil servants in Ireland, how would they be supported, and essentially they had made an arrangement where they would continue working provided they had continuity of employment, reasonable promotion prospects, and a continuity of pension rights. Right. Okay. There's a very interesting doctorate done on that. I can't remember the gentleman's name who's done that.
A guy named Martin McGuire did a thesis and published a book on the transfer, on the civil service. And he quoted in his title the reaction of one civil servant when introduced to Michael Collins in Dublin Castle in early January 1922. He talked about having to shake the bloodstained hand of Mr. Collins on that. But it's sometimes pointed out that the Irish Free State started off with a number of advantages. And one of them was having a functioning civil service who continued on with the exact same roles. As somebody said, the only difference was, instead of starting off your response to a query with "Dear Sir" or "Dear Madam," you started off with a card. But it continued on almost seamlessly. But also bear in mind that in particular senior civil servants were offered the option of transferring to Stormont, to the Northern Ireland Civil Service, if they wanted, and so on like that. So with the exception of the police, the RIC was obviously disbanded. Virtually everything else continued until the Free State started to reform the public service. That's a long, long story.
Just one comment.
There were two regiments that weren't disbanded. There was Royal Irish Fusiliers, effectively against the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and the Irish Guards, three that weren't disbanded. And
4 if you count the Irish Guards.
yeah, so and that was a political thing. That's sort of an obvious thing. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a very interesting thing, as Tom mentioned, there were 3 regiments of the regular regiments not disbanded. The War Office, the Exchequer, the Department of Finance in the UK, were insisting that 12 battalions that the army be reduced by 12 battalions with the Irish settlement. And that, of course, would mean 6 regiments, each of 2 battalions. And the Royal Irish Fusiliers, who recruited in Armagh, Louth, Meath, Monaghan, were slated for disbandment. But the Royal Enniskilling Fusiliers, the officers there, and the Royal Irish Fusiliers made an agreement. Each would be reduced to 1 battalion. So the Royal Irish Fusiliers, the Fogs, were saved, and the Treasury got its 12 battalion reduction. But that's how they managed that. But that applied just to those.
I was going to say that actually.
Well, I'll shut up.
It's a metric of success when you're fighting for life.
Just this seminar is very interesting to me because my father and his 2 brothers both were in the First World War. Just they went along different routes, if you like. My father joined in Limerick, and I give the date as September 1916, which is relevant. And he joined because of John Redmond's influence. But when he joined, he was sent straight away, not to an Irish regiment, but to the Royal Field Artillery, and then to the Royal Garrison Artillery, training in England. And the training was extensive, unlike some comments made earlier. He was 14 months training in all aspects of artillery before moving to the front line in November 1917, and he was injured, lost fingers and got shrapnel damage, and he got a pension of 19 shillings and 6pence per week, a little bit more than the widow. So that was a slightly different line. He also joined the Irish Army, but left it very quickly. Maybe he'd have lost the 1906, but there was also a family farm connection there for him. The 2 brothers joined as regular soldiers the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and one was captured day 1 and spent his time in Limburg and had a relatively good time, and the other had come back from Gallipoli and was sent on the front, and he was injured again. When they left in 1919, I didn't understand that they could join any British regiment. They just left and were let go. Now my father joined for the duration of the war. They joined as regular soldiers. But in the offer that was made to them was to go to Canada on paid passage and live their life out there. So that's what one of them took it up. So just, that's two slightly different lines. And thank you for a very interesting lecture.
Would you just say briefly, a lot of soldiers who came back had commitments during the public service or in some bigger companies like Railways or Guinnesses and so on, that they get their jobs back, but the small print said they get their jobs back if they're capable of doing them. And I think the Guinness archives, a long time since I looked at it, was something like 27% of men who came back weren't able to do the jobs they left. But on those, in fairness to Guinness, unlike the railway companies, they gave them other jobs, and they would pay them enough when you combine it with their disability from the army to get them back to where they were before they left. So there was some limited social supports for some people, depending on where they worked. And one other thing, a lot of people joined post, I don't know how many, never looked at the figures, but you know, the idea was you get land if you served in the army, came back, you get a small holding. But unfortunately, a lot of the men who went away weren't capable of family or much else either. Thanks.
Just a quick one, Patrick. Yeah. Just a quick one on that, Pat.
One of the important things that we should remember about this is that these fellas came back, we know what the story is, but they were in the same pot at the end of the bed as everybody else was. And we tend to think, and one of the things that I sort of was discovering over the years, these poor ex-servicemen, God love them. Okay, so I think it's important. So my sympathy towards the ex-servicemen, and God loved them, it was tough. Yes, it was, and the women who with them and their families. But they didn't have the monopoly on tragedy. I think that's an important point to make.
And just on that, I think there's the instinct among the men and their families to attribute everything that they suffered afterwards to the war service, right? You see this even in what you're saying from the woman, commenting on that man in 1960, and she's saying, he's a difficult man. Yes. All of this, I'm sure, is down to the war. And this is very common that everything is linked back to that, regardless of all of the other circumstances that might have affected them in their lives. I've also been going to the military service pensions collection recently and looking at the families and widows of men who served and were killed serving with the IRA in the War of Independence or in the Civil War. And they have similar sorts of issues arising decades later, living in similar sorts of poverty, feeling maligned and excluded by the state for various different reasons. And so I think what these applications and these welfare organisations, they show us the challenges of life in 20th century Ireland. They show us the social conditions, the enduring poverty that many families experienced, and the sort of competing narratives that people were, using, and how many people felt excluded or marginalised for whatever reason from the state. But it didn't have to be due to your war service, but so much was affected by your own local community and where you felt your place within that. But I think it's really important to say that these, as Tom says, it isn't just the veterans who are struggling in this period, and it's a very common trope among IRA veterans families as well.
So could I just say, sorry, but the only point I'm making, life is a lottery. The only point I'm trying to make is that if you were on active service in some places, you were pretty well guaranteed to come back in very poor health. And I know people who were very fit, physically and not so with their mental state. Anyone who joined any army, you'd have to question their mental state, but I put that physically. Anytime you know yourself. We both know people like that. But anyway, no, I'm simply saying that, you can lead a very, very rough life. You can get a lot of exposure to things that you wouldn't encounter in other normal civilian occupation. That's all I'm saying. Life is a lottery. Some people win, some people lose.
On that, think of the number of guys that came back from Salonika with malaria and suffered for the rest of their lives, and that because it was chronic in the Macedonian front. But a word in defence of the railways, and I hasten that I'm no connection with them, but I came across a very interesting document. All the railwaymen who volunteered were guaranteed their jobs back. When they were coming back in 1919, the board of the Great Southern Railway authorised a bonus of £5, significant sum of money at the time, for each guy coming back and rejoining. A guy in Limerick who had been a railway employee, who had joined up and who was wounded and discharged, unfit for service and unfit for work. He heard of this, wrote to the board of the Great Southern Railway asking, admitting that he could not work again, but asking could he have the bonus. And scribbled across the bottom from the MD of the Great Southern Railway at the time was, he does not qualify for the bonus. Award him a gratuity of £20 instead. Which was fair enough at the time. But when you talk about, and I think one of the great things, and Fionnuala would know far, far more about this, about the impact on families afterwards and on individuals, what we now call post-traumatic stress. The Collins family in Waterford, 6 sons joined up. 4 of them were killed. The 5th was captured in Silesia, was regarded as missing, believed dead. He served his time in horrific conditions in a prisoner of war camp in Bulgaria. He came back to the surprise of everybody, back home to Waterford, but he was a mental wreck. He spent the rest of his life in and out of psychiatric hospitals. But I remember when I was reading about this first, in the newspaper long ago, it just shows you what they thought at the time. They mentioned that the 6th guy, and I quote, survived the war unscathed. Now, I don't know how you get unscathed if 4 of your brothers are killed and another one ends up a psychiatric wreck. But that kind of impact must have been horrific on families.
And it was absolutely horrific. And one of the cases I came across, and I alluded to it there, was Private Gannon. And he was, of the cases I came across, he was one of the last British soldiers who served in the National Army who died during the Civil War. He was the guy who was shot a few days before the instruction went out to cease hostilities. And he had married in the interval between leaving the British Army and joining the Irish Army. And in the pension records, it's the story of his wife. And she essentially had a nervous breakdown and ended up being committed. And she lived until, I believe, sometime in the 1960s. And in the pension records, there's a long and very tawdry exchange of letters between the Irish Department of Defence and the Irish Department of Social Welfare as to who is financially responsible for this woman. And you know, so there was trauma there. It went on for years and years and years, and you know, they got very little help, and what was given was begrudged.
There's a man at the very back.
Thank you. Thank you all speakers for what's been a wonderful day of very illuminating insights into the period. I've 2 questions really. One concerning figures. Arthur, you mentioned during your talk that the probable number of transferees from the 5 regiments concerned to the National Army was around 11 or 1200 or something like that, of the 10,000 who didn't continue in service, something of that nature. Yeah, and it's just that the gentleman's not here with us now, but Dr. Emmanuel Destiny in Sorbonne or whatever, in his talk he mentioned the overall figure for the full service as being of the order of 15,000, I thought he said, in terms of those who'd been in the British Army and served either in the National Army or in the IRB or IRA at the period.
Yeah.
I was surprised at the size of that figure. Is that correct? That's consistent to have two figures of that degree.
Yeah, it's because you.
Because I'm aware it's full divisions, 10, 16, and 36 divisions we're talking about in that latter figure. Does that explain the big escalation in the figure overall?
Yeah, essentially what you're talking about in the work that I did, we were looking at men who had served in the 5 regiments between 1919 and 1922. Okay, so it's 12,000 men. And we found 1,100 of them had gone into the National Army. There's a lot of other evidence out there looking at Great War veterans in general. So there's 200,000 Irishmen from the island of Ireland who served in British forces during the First World War. Maybe 110,000, 120,000 from the south. Okay. And after the Civil War, there was a huge reduction in the National Army, and it caused huge trouble. It caused essentially an army mutiny. Okay. That's who was going to go. They were going to go from 50,000 people down to, I think, less than 20,000. I can't remember the exact numbers. So who goes? And that caused a mutiny, and after that mutiny was addressed, there was an inquiry into the National Army, and the Chief of Staff wrote a report at the time where he said, in the National Army during the Civil War, in his opinion, maybe as many as 50% of the soldiers in the Irish National Army had previously seen British service. So that's where that 25,000 figure comes from. We don't know exactly, okay? But it was very substantial. And there's lots of anecdotal stories out there about, new recruits coming into the National Army and being brought places, and, with people like the Special Infantry Corps, and, on the first day getting into a scrap, and suddenly these guys, they know how to conduct themselves, they know how to load a rifle, they know what to do when someone shoots at them, because they've done it before. They've served, whether during the war or post-war. So there's a lot of evidence there. So it's not inconsistent. It's to do with the research. What I was doing was looking at a very small subset of people, and what Emmanuel was talking about was the total cohort of Great War veterans. Okay, so about maybe as many as half of the people in the National Army had British military experience.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. I wasn't aware of that magnitude of figure. I recognise Dr. Pat. Were you going to say something? I should have.
No, I was just going to add that apart from the numbers, do not underestimate the input of senior officers with British experience. Guys like Emmett Dalton, guys like General William Murphy, who had risen from the ranks with, I think, the Royal Irish Fusiliers to command to colonel level during the war, came back, joined the National Army when it was forming, and was in command down at Limerick at the Battle of Kilmallock and so on like that. These guys had experience, huge experience with troops, and that was very, very important. So at both senior level and at the PBI, the Poor Bloody Infantry, they had made a huge contribution. And in specialist areas, one area in particular would be the Air Corps. All ex-RAF pilots initially, ex-RAF fitters, mechanics, etc.
Amazing. A pity we didn't maintain an Air Force since those days. I don't know if there's much. If I may, one second question, if Colonel Buckley will allow. You mentioned there in passing Emmett Dalton, which gives rise to my second question, if I may. I don't want to have the mic. If anyone objects, put up your hand, I'll shut up. But second question, the war itself, that great unnecessary war, 1418, casualties as mentioned, 35,000, the KIA, and double that for injuries of other forms. Big number, traumatic for Ireland and all the home islands or home countries, home nations here, and Europe, and a catastrophe. 1920s newly liberated, if you could say that, Ireland or Irish Free State with its own army. Rather like a topic for a future comparative study, I would have thought the National Army and the RIC, the same thing was happening all over the place, you know, with those two forces. But in 1920s Ireland, we had emigration. Emigration by who? People who'd had their big houses burned in the south or south of the border. We've had also loyalist Southerners, Unionist Southerners, regular and irregular Republicans, nationalists, and women, as was pointed out by Dr. Fionnuala. Emmett Dalton's relevant because he went to the US in the end, did he not, and became a successful Hollywood director of sorts or consultant. This was also traumatic for the country. But I think the numbers involved in emigration in the 1920s would come pretty close to what happened in Ireland in the 1860s, not the 40s, or maybe the 1850s. It was significant, like the 1950s. And I think we're talking about numbers that might be as big over that 10-year period as 250,000 to 400,000 to 500,000 people. As many families as had died or had connections with people who had died in the Great War, I would think, you know, just your reflection on that question. The comparative nature of the 20s trauma and the 1910s trauma, you know, that these were both equal in magnitude in terms of their effect on families. I'll leave it at that. If you have anything to say, I'm open to opinions. Thank you.
Well, you go first.
I suppose I don't think one can really compare the impact of emigration in the 1920s on a family as to the loss of somebody on war service. Especially by the 1920s, many people are leaving, they're going to Britain, many going further afield, but by that stage, literacy rates are very high, people are keeping in regular contact. It's not the same as the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s of the wake when somebody's leaving. And I don't think we can see trauma. It is a trauma, and it's for communities who are wiped out by emigration, it had a massive impact. But I don't think it's the same as that experience by the Hackett family in County Offaly who buried 3 children in active service, right? And I think also when we look at numbers of emigration in the 1920s, some of these are people stationed in Ireland as part of the British administration, okay, and British military families and so forth, that leave after the establishment of the Free State. We've quite high numbers from, you know, the Curragh and various other areas leaving at that stage. But it's not necessarily, these are not necessarily people who've been in Ireland for decades or who, you know, it's people whose jobs have ended here in a sense. So when we think about Protestant population or loyalist, you know, numbers fleeing and, you know, demographic change, there's a lot of complicated things happening there. And it's not all, you know, trauma in that same sense. That's what I say on that one.
One thing about, you have to remember, about emigration in the 1920s. Emigration had been legally forbidden during the First World War. Britain did not want to have young Irishmen heading for the States when they could be joining the army. So there was a pent-up demand, if you like, for people who wanted to emigrate, who took advantage in the 1920s. The other thing is, before the war, Ireland had 2 main functions in the British economy: a supply of cheap food and a supply of cheap labour. We resumed that role after independence because we maintained the same economic policies, etc. And it took us a while to start to use the freedom that we had to develop a separate economy. So, but I agree totally with Fionnuala. The idea then of the literacy, like you take for example, people who emigrate nowadays and they can go on Zoom and they can hop on a plane and so on like that. Traveling is now far less traumatic than it was when an American wake was a goodbye forever, and that, and no contact and so on. But don't underestimate the pent-up demand for the emigrant boat that was there in the 1920s.
And it's also, though, it's a comparative thing, because, as Pat said, there was a huge pent-up demand to get out of Ireland. But the Civil War caused huge economic devastation in Ireland. I mean, there was a huge disruption to infrastructure. There was railway bridges blown up. There were banks raided. There were, the big houses were burnt down. And so a lot of money left Ireland as well. So you have this situation where you don't have a rich country necessarily to begin with. It's just fought a war. Okay, so the budgets of the Irish Free State, if I remember correctly, in 1922-23, something like £24 million sterling. That's the total government budget. Okay, we spend 50 billion, I think, at the moment. It's 24 million. And 40% of it was being spent on the army. So you don't have money to invest. You don't have organizations like the IMF or something like that where you can borrow from. You've had huge devastation to the economic infrastructure of the country, and then the opportunity to go abroad comes up. You just go to the UK, to go to the US or whatever, and people avail of that.
Hi there. My wife's grandfather joined the Royal Engineers as a sapper in 1910. He served in the Eastern and Western fronts, first as a private and then as an acting corporal. And in July 1918, he was sent from Salonika back to Moore Park in Fermoy to undergo officer cadet training. And after his training was completed, he was appointed as a second lieutenant of the Royal Ulster Fusiliers and immediately discharged to the military reserve. And he did serve again with the British Army in 1939 to 1944. Some of the motivation for which might have been down to the volatility of his marriage, admittedly. But I'm often surprised that he wasn't deterred by doing so by his presence in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday in 1920. As a Tipperary man who was there to support Tipperary, and his newly acquired brother-in-law was among those shot and wounded. But I'm just wondering, has there been any research done on the proportion of Irish servicemen discharged to the military reserve after World War I who actually served again in the Second War? Any ideas?
I don't have any strict research, but I'm just going through all of the British Army enlistment records that it comes up very regularly. So you see a soldier who served in the British Army, maybe in the Munster Fusiliers or the Royal Dublin Fusiliers or something similar. They are discharged when the regiments are disbanded, and you see a little note added in about a later service, and it might be a later service in 1924 or 25, okay, or it might even be as in your family situation during the Second World War, and it's noted there, so it's quite common. But I also came across people who had served in the British Army, in these regiments, who were discharged, came home, served in the Irish Army. Irish Army expands during the war and then contracts very severely afterwards, and they're let go again from the Irish Army, and they go and rejoin the British Army. So it happened quite regularly.
Just a quick one. I found 80 fellows who served in both wars out of 6,000 who served in both wars, First World War and Second World War. I found one fellow who I'm yet to nail this fellow down, who went through the three: war, First World War, and Second World War. I think it might be a miscalculation here, but 80, which is a very small number. The last guy I showed on the screen there was Kevin Cunningham. Talking to Kevin, his father tried to enlist again in the Second World War, And he went up, it's a quick story, he went up to the recruiting office in Belfast. Now, fortunately, he lost his teeth. They'd given him quinine when he was captured in March 1980, he lost his teeth. And the recruiting sergeant in Belfast said to him, Sergeant Cunningham, we can't take you. You've no teeth. And his reply was, Sergeant, I don't want to bite the bastards, I want to shoot them. So he came back down, and hence Kevin was born. He said that on his
the clock is the enemy of all great military operations. And Tom has given me the eyes. So we take a couple more questions and then we'll start a wrap.
Well, this one takes long. Pat, you mentioned Royal Fusiliers being involved in the North Russian campaign. I know the Royal Irish Fusiliers were, but I have no record. And the reason I have an interest in this is my aunt used to tell us that your Uncle Tom was at the Dardanelles, Bowman Campbell, and Archangel. But since I haven't been able to get any information, so where do you think the WW1?
No, the Dublin Fusiliers, because they were based in Constantinople, some of them were sent over towards Sevastopol and places like that to safeguard and try and recover huge stocks of military supplies which had been supplied to the Allies, by the Allies to Russia, try and take it back, and if not, to try and make sure that it ended up in the hands of the White Russians. So, it was based around, as I said, they had this idea, and they actually named the British Army of the Black Sea. It never could comprise more than a couple of battalions based in Constantinople, but some of them were sent over, as I say, to try and safeguard stores, to try and arrange for the evacuation of British citizens and so on like that, and give some assistance to the White Russians and so on like that. I'm not aware of them being an archangel. Again, where there was a far more substantive intervention there. Again, primarily to try and recover the huge amount of military equipment and stores that is sent to Russia.
My own feeling is that it was a composite group. The British soldiers were there and the Irish regiments, the Royal Irish Fusiliers and elements of the Dove who could have been sort of in that hub.
Yeah. And you also had guys who were sent on small military missions. For example, Crozier, who ended up commanding the auxiliaries here in Ireland, he spent time, I think it was in either Latvia or Lithuania, helping them to make an army to withstand the Russians in 1919. So you have small deployments and little things like that right around. And as I said at the beginning, it's no wonder the budget may have been 285, the exchequer might have wanted 80, but the actual expenditure was 425 million that year, So you have an awful lot of bits and pieces around.
Second last question. Last.
Thank you very much. Much has been said about the senior non-commissioned officers and officers who joined other regiments. Has any research been done about how many of them came back to our country?
I think the silence is eloquent.
I think the very strong feeling I got from and this is very subjective, just looking at those, where a lot of those men had developed connections outside of Ireland, and sometimes you can see it. You're looking at a set of records and you're seeing guys, and one of the things in the British records tells about the guy when he joined and where he served, but also tells about his family and where they got married and how many kids they had. And you can see that the connection for many of these guys is no longer in Ireland. The connection is, they've married someone in the UK, they've had the kids in the UK, they tend to stay over there. And maybe that is part of what contributed to it. And so I suspect, and this is only a suspicion, this is very on a tiny small amount of anecdotal information, a lot of them didn't come back. Okay, and that's only a suspicion. But it was very much come down to circumstances and what happened to people when they left. I know in my wife's family, her grandfather had been in the British forces, had left, had actually spent some time in Ireland during the Troubles, had left afterwards, and then in 1926, when had actually returned. So it did happen. It really came down very much to family circumstances and where they put down roots.
If you're looking for a source to find out about the British officers who came back after 1922, British Legion records. I mean, if you look at the British Legion right throughout the Free State, it is littered with Colonel this, Brigadier that, Vice Commandant this, all over the place. So these guys came back, kept their heads down, and then networked their regimental associations very quietly under the scene. So if you're looking for a sort of a primary source to research, I'd look at the British Legion records and pull out the names of Brigadier Rees-Mogg, Smuggers, or who's your man in the House of Lords at the House of Commons at the moment, the Minister for, what's his name? Rees-Mogg, yeah, okay. The Rees-Mogg of this world, settled in very, very posh houses in County Laois and Limerick and places like that. So there's a source for you.
That's a gross characterisation.
Okay, with regard to an indication of whether the serving members of the Irish regiments had any indication that there was a change coming, my great-grandfather served in the 18th Royal Irish, as his son did, and his son was retired in the Curragh as a senior barrack warden in 1911. And he was actually born in Aldershot. But on the census record, he put down that he was born in the same place as his wife, which was County Westmeath. So that was some indication that even in army service, they knew changes were coming. Might be, and on the other hand, Deirdre, you didn't mention that Mother Mary Martin, she found the medical missions very and contributed a lot to venereal or tropical diseases, particularly apart from the hospital in Drogheda, of course, talking about people who served in both wars, there's a fellow O'Neill, he's buried in Hoylake, and he had a VC from the First World War, and he served briefly at the end of when he served time in the Service Corps, I think, during the Second World War. I don't think he saw action during it anyway, but he was from Monaghan, or I think he was from Monaghan, and he's buried in Hoylake near Liverpool. Finally, the Air Corps is in a situation that it may get more money. It's in the situation that it's in now because of lack of funds. However, I served in the Air Corps. I served in the Air Corps during the Congo airlift. On the first day of the Congo airlift, there were 12 C-130 Hercules aircraft arrived in Bandon. The 12 of them were dispatched, all bound for the Congo. Right now, at the moment, there's a group from the Air Corps, pilots and engineers, and they're over-training the US Air Force on the use of the helicopter and the uses they have put to their helicopters. And if you're all aware, all of the medical rescues that the Air Corps have done in recent years and over the last number of years. So that's the Air Corps. Thank you.
We've been asked to give a couple of reflections on what has been a fantastic day, and I shall leave the final word to the serving soldier. But I just have a few comments, and thank you to the panel, because it's been really enlightening. There's lots of threads really to pull together. I'm going to group my comments into three pieces. There's a personal piece, there's a work piece, and then there's a societal piece. I'm very fortunate enough to have been married to a very forgiving Belfast girl who's followed me around the planet through the entirety of my military career. I say a Belfast girl, she ended up there by accident. Her father's family are a Cavan family, and her mother's side springs from a Royal Irish Constabulary man who was born in Mallow, County Cork, but in 1922 found himself in Lisnaskea, and so switched his eye for a U and became a sergeant in the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Not a B special, I can tell you that. I think the family, as far as it is reflected in Carmel's side of the family, tells an awful lot of what we've been talking about here today, and how there isn't a model that you can slap on everything. On her father's side, the Cavan side, there is a headstone in the graveyard in Cavan, which lists his grandfather Peter's side of the family. Peter died, leaving the headstone on which were engraved the names of his children, which included another Peter, who is proudly engraved as being a lieutenant in the Cavan battalion of the IRA. Also one of his daughters, who is listed as being a member of Cum Naman. Below them is listed Peter's brother Michael, and all there is there is a date of death, which is the 25th of August 1916. I researched Michael. Michael died serving with the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers on the Somme on the 25th of August 1916. So families can't even separate this struggle. The division lines run through it. Further south, as Carmel's grandfather on our mother's side was making his way north, we come upon the Starr family, and both Michael and Tom Starr served in the British Army during the Great War. Both of them were the Connaught Rangers or the South Irish Horse, but they both ended up in the Connaught Rangers in the end. Both of them received a grant from the Irish Land Commission in 1925. A house and I think it was 36 acres, all sitting in a little township just outside Ballinasloe. That's where I courted my wife Carmel, on Mick Starr's land at Barnaboy in just outside Ballinasloe. So in terms of them being forgotten or being treated badly, again, it's not a level playing field right across the piece. And I get what Tom says, that there was no monopoly of misery for the veteran of the Great War. But what I would say is that what has been lost in the sands of time was that the vast majority of those men from Ireland who went to fight, and I mean the vast majority, because Ulster might tell you differently, but the majority of recruits to the British Army during the Great War came from the south, rural, poverty-stricken Irish Catholics. That is where the burden lay, and the majority of them joined because they felt that it was the thing they were being encouraged to do in terms of fighting for that thing that was home rule and beyond. Circumstances changed, not their fault. The next thing I'd just like to say is about work, and really here focusing on some of the things that Fionnuala brought out. I'm dealing with a case at the minute of a soldier who fought in Musakala in 2006. A particularly brutal time because A, they didn't know what they were getting into, as in the British Army didn't know what they were getting into. B, they sent them there without the wherewithal to deal with what they eventually got into. And C, we had no idea about how to deal with PTSD, and it's only coming to light now. Since the NATO pulled out of Afghanistan in August last year, I've had 4 veterans of that campaign kill themselves from my regiment, a single battalion. So we are dealing with PTSD, and it's here and it's bad. And it belongs to every one of us, because I'm sure there will be people in this room who will be surprised to hear that there are estimated to be 500 Royal Irish Regiment veterans of the Afghan campaign who came from and have returned to the Republic of Ireland. So we are dealing with people in the south today as well. So that is a problem. And likewise, I do believe that the Defence Forces as well are dealing with their own cases of PTSD. And finally, a societal piece, and really linking into something that was said by the gentleman at the back. After the French Revolutionary Wars, Napoleonic Wars, whatever you want to call them, we went through, in Europe, a massive economic crisis, principally because after the war, agricultural prices plummeted. And as a consequence of that, an economy that was almost wholly based on agriculture became the place that the British Army came to recruit, and that was Ireland. And not just the Irish regiments, every regiment of the British Army came here to recruit. If you go to Tralee and look at the two monuments outside the courthouse there, they list the names and regiments of the Munster men who died for their king and country. That's what it says on it. I'm not putting it in. And a minority of them are actually Munster Fusiliers. The majority of them served in the East and West Middlesex regiments, the Leicestershire regiment, and all other regiments under the sun. So, post-Napoleonic War, yes, there was emigration, massive emigration, not just to America, Australia, Canada, but also to the British Army and also to England, where they couldn't get jobs, so they joined the British Army from England. And so the thin red streak tipped with steel at Balaclava, a Scottish regiment, was almost 40% an Irish regiment, because Irish men had joined up through the Scottish recruiting system. We see a similar societal surge at the end of the Great War, and again, very similar circumstances. The market or prices fall in agricultural produce, a rural economy based on agriculture. Where do people go? And they continue to go to the British Army. And I think, as we found today, whichever way you cut it, whether it was 1,100 or 25,000, it still doesn't, in that period, match the numbers of young men who left rural Ireland to join the British Army during that same period. So the British Army has this consistency running through it of service in the British Army. It is a tradition. You can argue that it is economic necessity, but it is a tradition. And all I would say is word of warning, because whether the Great War was unnecessary, and I'll take you around the back and punch you over that one, sir. We're facing a situation at the minute where we've just managed to struggle out of COVID, and we're now dealing with another war that is having a huge economic impact globally. And we may be sending them things that go bang, but we're not actually fighting it ourselves, but we're still feeling it. And I don't wonder if that's not going to have a similar impact. And the one thing that is certain is that armies will always be there, and people will continue to join them. Mad as we might be, Parry, but people will still join them. And at the front of the queue will be the Irishman. He's always served, and he always will serve, and so will she nowadays. So they are my reflections. Thank you very much, Tom, for a great day.
I'm really lazy in sitting because I need to read my notes. First of all, I want to start by thanking all of the wonderful speakers for the very thought-provoking presentations they made today. They were all truly fascinating. I'm going to go through very briefly chronologically. Dr. Pat highlighting the experiences of the Irish regiments after the war. I hadn't been aware of their activities in Germany. It was really interesting. It was particularly interesting for you to highlight the power of the Treasury. Can I confirm for you, as a 21st century soldier, nothing has changed. Arthur, you confirmed something I think I always believed and knew, but you confirmed it very clearly, the value of highly trained and professional personnel, and the National Army being smart enough to facilitate their recruitment, albeit on an individual basis, through the Civil War, and there's little doubt that such numbers of highly trained personnel could be truly decisive in combat terms in such a conflict. It was also great to see the personal and professional development of the individuals, many coming in at basic ranks and progressing to much higher ranks in the service. In the afternoon, Dr. Emanuel made me aware of something that I hadn't been aware of, that the large numbers of former British soldiers joining the IRA. It's not a linear journey, and it's not something you always think about, and they were troubled by questions of trust and jealousy, but nonetheless they valued their service because they were useful. Tom then highlighted a whole series of personal and very tragic stories, and I take your point that the veterans had no monopoly on tragedy, but they certainly experienced a great deal of it. And the reality of war, that it does not end in the battlefield. And they came back to a country newly independent, where the new government, the Irish government, didn't see British Army veterans as being their problems. And equally important, the citizens of the new republic looked for their heroes elsewhere, and the veterans of the Great War were allowed, stand in the shadows. It highlights the treatment of veterans highlights a very important issue for us, and I want to praise the work of one of our own charities, the Organisation for Ex-Service Men and Women, who provide tremendous support to veterans of the Defence Forces. Our last speaker, Fionnuala, story of loss, loss of love, loss of status, purpose, post-war discrimination, immigration, which I hadn't been aware of, very interesting to hear about it, poverty, emotional loss is one thing, but physical, the loss of funding, material loss can be profound as well, one of family trauma and hostility. As a serving member of the Defence Forces, Óg here, I feel you have all established a very strong link between those returning Great War veterans, many of whom served in the Irish regiments of the British Army, and today's Army, our Defence Forces, because we're much more than an army. I have been privileged in my work in Brussels to visit graveyards across Belgium and in France, and seeing the final resting place of thousands of Irishmen. And those Irishmen came from every town, every parish across this island. And it is no doubt that they are owed a debt of gratitude for their service, both in the Great War and to those who subsequently served in the National Army. Many were treated poorly, but it is never too late to acknowledge their sacrifice, and an event such as today is a step in that direction. I want to finish by thanking Tom for bringing this together. These things never happen by accident. He assures me it wasn't a completely sleepless night, but always so. But thank you and congratulations, and final thank you.